My job is watching a woman trapped in a room. Part 2.
I had to do something, and I had to do it right now. If Melanie was somehow a fake, that meant they must have sent her. And if they sent her, that meant they knew. They knew about the messages in her painting. They knew about me asking questions. And they knew I didn't hit a button during any of it. I felt panic and fear crawling up my chest, making it hard to breathe. Standing up, I started pacing, periodically glancing back at the monitor to see if Rachel could help me, tell me what I needed to do next. But she had laid down on her bed. It was hard to tell for sure with her back to the camera, but I think she was crying. No, I needed to fix this. Get her out of there. And if I didn't have a better plan, I'd just have to go with the one I already had. Feeling the hard eye of the ceiling camera on me, I went to the door and stepped back into the locker room. My phone was in my locker, and after messing up the combination the first time, I got the door open and got it out. Gripping it tightly, I tried to hold it by my side casually, but I knew there was little point. If they knew everything, I wasn't going to be able to hide anything. I just had to try and be fast, get some kind of message out to people that could help Rachel before they got to me. I opened the camera on the phone as I re-entered the surveillance room and hit record. It made a small beeping noise, and once I was sure it was recording, I turned the camera on myself. My name is Tommy. Thomas Calhoun. And my job is watching a woman trapped in a room. This is not a joke or a movie or whatever. This is real. For 3 years my job is to sit in this room. I moved the camera slowly around the room, taking in the door to the bathroom, the water cooler, the desk with the monitors, keyboard, and button box, and watch a video feed of a woman locked up in a bedroom somewhere. I stepped closer to the desk and made sure the monitor showing Rachel was clear and in focus. I didn't know this woman was a prisoner at first, or I tricked myself into thinking she wasn't because the money was good. Either way, I know she is now. She is in danger, and so am I. After lingering on video of her for a few more seconds to make sure every detail could be seen, I turned the camera back on myself. I had to hurry, or the video might be too big to send quickly. I was trying to stay calm, but I felt myself tearing up as I went on, and I did my best to keep my words clear. Please help her. I don't know where she is. I don't know who has her, because I don't know who I really work for. But they are bad people and she is not safe. All I know is that I work at a building at, redacted, right outside of San Antonio. Per no sleep rules, to be clear, this address is not real. I only know the names of 2 other people connected to this place. The man who hired me, Mr. Solomon. And a man who might have a job like mine, Charlie Jeffries, I think. I don't know if they are real people. I don't know if that is their real names. Please. I'm not crazy. I know how this sounds. Just come here, see the room. Figure out where she is and help her. Anne. I heard the muffled sound of the outer door opening into the locker room, and I frantically fumbled with the phone to stop the recording. How do I send? Oh no, how do I? There it is. I hit the button to share, and felt a new panic rising. Who should I send it to? I had only a handful of contacts, and I just selected them all. Maybe at least one of them would take it seriously and get help. As I heard the door to the surveillance room opening behind me, I hit send. Not connected to data service or Wi-Fi. Please send again when connected. What? No. I turned to see Mr. Solomon entering the room. He was flanked by 2 large men in dark suits that looked like bodyguards or something. Raising a finger, he wagged it at me. No service in here, Thomas. But then you should never need service in here, so long as you followed the rules. They took me easily. I tried to make it to the bathroom and close the door, but the 2 guards stopped me and pulled me down. They put the, what do you call them? Zip ties on my hands and feet and pulled a black bag over my head. Then I was being carried out of the room and it felt like they must have put me in the back of a van that was pulled right up to the building. I was laying on what felt like thin, weird-smelling carpet that covered a hard metal layer underneath. I heard someone get into the van with me, and I asked where we were going. If they would just take me and let Rachel go. There was a short laugh overhead and then Mr. Solomon's voice as he told me that he would explain everything when we got where we were going. For now, he said, I needed to relax. It was a long drive and I would need the rest. I went to say more, but then I felt a sharp pain in my neck. They had stabbed me, or, no, they injected me with something. I was feeling so strange now, but I had to stay awake. I had to try and get away, I had to. Hello again, Thomas. I blinked as I began looking around. My mouth was dry and my head hurt, but otherwise I felt okay. I wasn't tied up anymore. Instead, I was laying back on a padded table like I'd seen when I went to the doctor. But this wasn't a doctor's office. The room was large, and aside from the padded table, it held a small bed, a desk with a computer monitor on it, and a couple of chairs. Sitting in one of those chairs was Mr. Solomon. I raised up slowly, blinking at him. Where is she? Is Rachel okay? The man smiled. You really are something, Thomas. Trying to be the hero, even if you don't quite know how. I respect that. Licking his lips, he leaned forward slightly. In fact, I respect that so much that I've decided to start our new relationship with as much honesty as I'm allowed. Some of my colleagues disagree with this approach, but you know what? Fuck them. This is my project, and I think you deserve to know what's going on. Looking more serious, he stood up, lifting the gun he had been holding casually in his lap. But before we get into the details, would you like to see Rachel? I slid off the table and nodded as I caught myself from falling. My legs were still wobbly from whatever they had given me, but I barely noticed. Yes, please. Let me see her. The real her. Mr. Solomon gave a small laugh and gestured toward a nearby door. Yes, reality is always best. She's just there in the next room. I stumbled my way forward, my legs getting better as I walked, and when I grabbed the doorknob, it turned easily. I expected the door to lead to her bedroom, but instead it opened into another room a lot like the one I had been in, though the stuff in it was different. Strange machines filled the walls, and in the back of the room was a large aquarium. I didn't know. It was a big cylinder taller than I was, and it was filled with some kind of gray liquid. There was a shape in that liquid. Go ahead, Thomas. Feel free to go have a good look. You've earned it. I felt my stomach clenching tighter at Mr. Solomon's words and the meanness in them. My legs felt heavy again now, but it wasn't from the drugs this time. Shuffling forward, I could see the shape was a person. Oh no, or at least a body, because it was clear from just looking at it that the person was dead. It was very well preserved, but I could see how the skin hung wrong and looked bloated in spots. Oh God, no, its hair, which had been floating like seaweed in front of its face, drifted away as I reached the glass, and I could see Rachel staring out at me. Murderer. I turned on Solomon and started to run toward him when he shot me. Suddenly I was on the ground convulsing as he stepped closer. Don't worry, Thomas. It won't kill you. Just make you unable to move much for a bit. I heard more footfalls as my body began to still. Get him up, take him back to the other room. I could barely feel anything as I was carried back to the padded table and propped up into a sitting position. This time I was strapped down, but I guessed it was more so I didn't fall off, because I couldn't move anything other than my head, and even that just a little. I could hardly see at all for crying, but I recognized the blurry shape of Solomon sitting back down in front of me. Before you ask, well, when you are able to ask anything again, yes, that is Rachel. Not a fake Rachel, not a dummy, and not some kind of trick. As I said, the time for tricks is past. Now is the time for truth. Frowning slightly, he went on. Thomas, I understand that showing you her body that way, might seem very cruel. You may hate me for it right now. I would understand it if you did. But you called me a murderer, and at least in this specific context, I think that is unfair, because I didn't kill Rachel. In truth, I've been with this aspect of the project for only 7 years. He gestured back to the door behind him. And Rachel has been dead for over 8. I felt my eyes widen as though they belonged to someone else's body. It was more lies. More tricks. All of it. Oh God, it had to be. Do you know what remote viewing is? He rolled his eyes. Sorry, right, you can't talk right now. I'll just assume you don't. Remote viewing is a broad term for the ability to see things that are far away from you physically, to know things you shouldn't be able to know through your normal 5 senses. Some describe it as a psychic ability, though there are several schools of thought as to how and why it works. His eyes fixed on mine intently. Because it does work, Thomas. Various governments and private organizations have studied it for a very long time, and while publicly it is always ridiculed as pseudoscience and foolish superstition, the reality is that some people have the innate ability, that means it comes naturally, to somehow see other places. Rachel was one of those people. She came into the program when she was 17, having been identified via a front-facing screening process that was ran as a psychological test that paid subjects well at a time when Rachel was looking to make some money. 3 months after being identified as a good candidate, she was taken, and after the initial adjustment period, she became a largely compliant asset that quickly rose to the top of our talent pool. Solomon folded his hands on his knee. I know you cared for her, Thomas, so I think this is worth sharing. Rachel was never treated badly, other than her confinement and the occasional test that was mildly unpleasant. No, we all treasured her. She was enormously talented, not just as a remote viewer, but as an artist. That's how she would convey what she saw, you understand. She would enter into an almost trance-like state when she painted, and when she was done, she would have given us a painting of images and words that provided, well, it was very valuable information. He chuckled. If you ever wondered, that's why there was always such care that the paintings were never shown to the camera. Picking at his pants, he went on. Rachel was so talented that she was selected for a new program that we thought might greatly enhance or alter her ability. We introduced something foreign into her body. At first, nothing seemed to change. If anything, the accuracy of her remote viewing was declining, which was a problem for us and for her. But then we realized that we were reading the new paintings wrong. She was able to see more clearly than ever. She just was no longer bound to only current events. Now her sight transcended time. He paused, and I realized he was enjoying telling the story. The bastard was having a good time, pausing to make it more dramatic. I would fucking kill him. While this made some of her paintings less immediately useful, they became much more valuable as we were able to decipher them. For a time, it looked as though everything was working better than we had ever hoped. His lips thinned. And then, one day, she showed a painting to the camera. It said, "Please help me, Thomases." This immediately sent up all kinds of red flags. She knew not to show paintings to the camera, and now she was trying to communicate with someone. We didn't disrupt her routine, but an intensive investigation began into who she was talking to. Was it one of her handlers? One of the technicians? Someone from her past life? But nothing checked out. Leaning back in his chair, a look of pride grew on Solomon's face as he continued. I was the one that first suggested the idea that she was, intentionally or not, knowingly or not, seeing and talking to someone in the future. I was still an outside consultant at the time, but by that point we had more strange behaviors from her, including the second message painting, "That girl isn't me." My theory made some sense, but it very quickly ran into a greater obstacle. The introduction of the foreign material had not been as seamless as we had hoped, despite her having been stable for almost 3 years since it was implanted. Whether it was due to her increasing emotional upset and stress, or simply the passage of time, she suddenly began to deteriorate. Her work became more erratic and hard to understand as her body began to decline. We were monitoring her health closely, but it didn't matter. 5 days after she painted That Girl Isn't Me, she suddenly went into cardiac arrest and died. Somewhat inexplicably, we were unable to resuscitate her. The man sighed. This was a great loss. And it required adjustments of my theory. Based on everything we knew, it still made sense that she was talking to someone. Someone with access to the camera feed, and very likely someone named Thomas. If Thomas was viewing that camera footage in the future, as I believed, then he must be working for us in the future. He gave me a thin smile. And whether you believe that the future is set in stone or not, I'm all for giving it a helping hand. 7 years ago I began the Thomas Project. Over the course of that time I have overseen the screening and hiring of 43 men named Thomas at several different sites, all with one very specific job. To watch the videos of Rachel from just before her implant to the time of her death. I tried to speak, but my mouth still wouldn't work. I wanted to say he was lying, that it didn't make sense, that it was another trick, but I think I wanted to hear it more for myself. Because I didn't think he was lying. I didn't think it was a trick. And I thought I was starting to understand. The point wasn't really them watching the videos, of course. It was how they reacted to watching the videos. What they did, and how that matched up with what Rachel had done in response in the past. 13% quit after the first day. 38% hit either the red or the green button after the first message asking for help and saying their name. 22% attempted to contact the authorities before reaching the stage where Melanie was introduced. He shook his head slightly. I wish I could take credit for her introduction, but it wasn't my suggestion. We assumed from the "That Girl Isn't Me" message that there was a double of Rachel introduced to you at some point, perhaps to kill you or dissuade you or find out what you knew. But it took a few tries until we felt it was well refined, and as I've pointed out, only 27% made it that far. And all of them failed the next test. He pointed at me. Her name. You see, the girl you've been watching, that talented, wonderful girl whose body is preserved in the next room. Her name was Rachel Donovan. I had always wondered if Rachel was merely seeing you, or if there was some kind of connection between the two of you. When you called Melanie Rachel, I knew that we had finally found the right Thomas, that distant point of light that our Rachel was looking at across space and time. I swallowed thickly and found I could feel my tongue, if only a little. Slurring badly, I pushed out a single word. W-I. Solomon looked surprised. I'd have thought that'd be clear by now. You're our only remaining link to one of our greatest treasures. Perhaps you have a similar ability, or it may be that she forged the link purely through her own talent and will. But either way, you are important and you have more work to do. He stood up and moved over to the table where he turned on the monitor. As it came to life, I saw it was a frozen image of Rachel's roommate tape paused where I had left off watching. Turning back to me, the man looked solemn. You have to watch the rest of it. Because Rachel painted you more pictures before she died, and we have to know what they mean. I spent the next 5 days watching Rachel die. From the outside, just watching the monitor, it didn't seem that different than what I had been watching for the past 3 years. Rachel slept, she watched TV, she read, and she painted. But there were signs if you were looking for them. She seemed tired and tense, and she had taken to sleeping more. And occasionally, just every once in a while, she would glance up at the camera, at me. It was then that I could see the fear and sadness in her eyes. Inside I felt like a burned-out house collapsing in on itself. At first I refused to watch, to do anything they wanted me to do. Solomon didn't get mad at me, but just shrugged. He said while cooperation was preferred and could go a long way toward making my stay with them more comfortable, it wasn't required. If he was right, Solomon said with a thin smile, things would play out as they were meant to, regardless of what I wanted or thought I chose. Either way, he added, the video was about to start back playing and would not stop for another 5 days. Whether I wanted to spend that time getting to see her again was entirely up to me. I tried to not watch, but a part of me knew from the start I was going to. Maybe I would find some clue that they were lying about her being dead. Or Rachel could give me some advice or warning about what I needed to do next. I didn't know. What I did know is that I couldn't miss the chance to see her again. And despite knowing in my heart that she was dead and everything on the video had happened a long time ago, I still felt that by watching I was with her somehow. She had been taken away from everything she knew when she was barely grown, trapped for years just for being special. Experimented on. Treated like property. Kept from ever having friends or family or a life. And yet through all that, she was still beautiful. Not just on the outside, but on the inside too. I had spent years watching her, getting to know her in 1,000 tiny ways that so few people ever truly know each other. I had seen her kindness and grace in her actions, even when she was fighting against the people holding her. I had watched her strength when she woke up day after day in her prison and never gave up. And I saw the beauty of her soul in her paintings, full of swirling colors and, what was the word, wonder. She was able to paint these things she saw with such care and love, despite living in a world that had abandoned her so completely. Well, I wasn't abandoning her. I would watch every bit of the video I could manage. Try to burn into my memory every frame of her I saw. Not for them and their stupid project. But for me. And for her. I may not have much left to do in my life before they lock me away somewhere or kill me, but I could do this one last thing. Rachel wouldn't die alone. I watched nearly all of it, stopping only to eat quickly and use the bathroom until the last 2 days. I would ask the guards to pause it, but they would only shake their heads and say Solomon said it had to play normally until it was finished. By the 4th day, I was in a stupor. I had already dozed some the first 3 days, but when I woke up on the 4th day, I could tell a few hours had passed. There were 2 trays of food on the bed, one breakfast and another lunch. I looked back at the screen in a panic, worrying I had missed something, but Rachel seemed to be just waking up too. I noticed her putting her hand to her stomach as she got out of bed and felt my own stomach twist. She was already hurting. Rachel glanced at the camera and tried to smile before moving to set up a new canvas for painting. This was the second of 3 paintings she did in those last days. The first had been the inside of an old-fashioned movie theater from the viewpoint of someone sitting in a back row. On the movie screen was just the image of a sledgehammer propped against a brick wall. I didn't understand what it meant, and I found myself scanning the picture for some message or other clue. Eventually, I found what might be one, though I didn't understand it either. Rachel must have come to understand they knew what she was doing with the paintings and didn't want to stop her, because these last 3 she set up much closer to the camera. I was still squinting and studying the painting closely when I realized the flipped-up seats in the next row up had brass number plates along the front edge of the seats. Though they were upside down from the viewpoint of the painting, the angle was good enough that once I noticed them I was able to read them. 2, 43, 26, 89. I didn't understand any of it, but I committed it all to memory, focusing all my attention on the painting until she finally took it away. Even that early on I could tell painting was taking a lot out of her now, and like I had for so long, I found myself talking to her, telling her to go rest before I remembered her body in the next room. I almost stopped then, but no. Maybe she couldn't tell I was talking to her, or maybe she could. Either way, me talking to her couldn't hurt, and it made me feel a little less lonely and sad as I watched her. The second painting, the one she started after I woke up from falling asleep for a few hours, was stranger than the rest. It looked like it was in a room with curved walls made of tree roots, and in the center of the room was a little table made out of the same stuff. Some of the roots around the room were a deep red, but other parts, including the table thing, looked burned and black. I looked closer and saw that I could see a person's shadow over the table, hands holding some long oval-shaped bundle. I studied it for a long time, going over it again and again in my mind after she took it away. I couldn't make sense of it. Of any of it. I wasn't smart enough, and I was failing her. Rachel slept for a long time after that painting. Then she got up on the 5th day, her last day, and immediately started working again. This time she was painting faster, and while I saw her wince occasionally, she never lost her look of determination as she slashed lines and colors across the canvas. When she was done, Rachel picked up the painting and turned it toward the camera, giving me a small, tired smile as she was blocked from view. It was looking out from the front porch of a house somewhere. It was out in the country, and the morning view of the yard and the land beyond were wonderful, but closer up the painting was of two hands. Holding on to each other tightly, their interlocked fingers seemed to glow red and orange in the light of the rising sun. I found myself crying as I looked at it. Part of it was because I didn't know what it meant, and I felt a growing sense of desperation at the thought that Rachel's last works might be wasted on me. Part was because I knew it had been 5 days, and I could sense I was close to the end. To her end. But there was something more to it than all that too. The last painting, even with everything else in my head and my heart pulling me down, gave me hope. Hope of what, I didn't know. But I started to think that maybe the only message Rachel had for me in that last painting was that somehow, somewhere, everything would be okay. Outside the edge of the painting I could see motion in the room. People hurriedly coming in with some kind of medical equipment. And then the monitor went black. You've done well, Thomas. Very, very well. For the last 5 days of video, we had charted 1,047 microvariations in Rachel's behavior that we believed might correspond to your behavior, your reactions, and your emotional states while watching the video. Like before, the two of you remained in sync as though you were in the same room. It really is remarkable. I sat staring at Solomon. I listened to what he said, but I didn't care. I just wanted it over. Whatever this was, I just wanted it over. Clearing his throat, he went on. That's why we've decided to move the implant from Rachel's body to your own. That's one of the many reasons we've preserved her so. The foreign body was still showing signs of life all this time, but just barely, and we were afraid to attempt removal. Our hope is that, given your connection to Rachel, it will accept you. Perhaps even thrive in you more than it ever did our girl. I was suddenly on my feet, and it was only the raising of Solomon's gun that stopped me from attacking him. Don't you fucking talk about her like that. Like any of you gave a shit about her. I'll fucking kill you. Solomon's face darkened slightly as his lips thinned. No, you won't. But if idle threats make you feel better, go ahead. It will only make things harder, not easier. Feeling a stab of panicked fear, I sat back down. What is this thing you're going to put in me? The man looked at me for several seconds before responding. I'm tempted not to tell you after your stupid, and frankly, hurtful, outburst. But I'll be the bigger person. Letting out a small sigh, he went on. Thomas, somewhere there is a tree. A very special tree. We suspect it is the same tree that Rachel painted for you that time, though we cannot say for sure, as we have never been able to find it. It is either hidden away very well or it is able to hide itself from those it wishes. I just looked at him, trying to kill him by just wanting it to be so. In any case, we have the next best thing. An ancient clipping from the tree. Secured at great cost and sacrifice, and studied for a long time without much success. We have, however, in recent years been given advice that this clipping could be grown in the right soil. We thought that soil was Rachel, but while it did develop further inside of her, she died before the necessary growth was finished. Leaning forward, he smiled at me. We have it on fairly good authority, however, that you might succeed where she failed. I fought them when they came, but it didn't matter. I woke up some time later with a dull ache in my chest and a small, already healing scar on my upper stomach. I didn't really feel that different other than the little bit of pain, but I knew that would change with time. Maybe I had more time than Rachel, or maybe I had less. It didn't matter. I just... Wait, what was that? There was some kind of soft voice, coming from where? It wasn't in the room. It was in my head. I felt a thrill of excitement. Maybe this was Rachel's voice. She had somehow stayed in the tree thing they had put inside me. But no. I had never heard Rachel's voice, but I sensed this wasn't it. This voice was too delicate to really be heard or understood, and it reminded me of music coming from a distant room that you felt in the back of your mind without realizing it. It was a melody, a kind of song. But it wasn't Rachel's song. I realized with a shiver that it was the song of the thing inside of me. At first I was afraid, but that didn't last long. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trapped here just like I was. But it started to sing, it was time for us to be free. I stood up and walked to the door, and as I did so, the lights went out. The door in front of me clicked, and when I reached out and turned the knob in the dark, it opened easily. How was this possible? And if it could do this, why hadn't it helped Rachel get out? There was no answer, but there was also no time. I could already hear boots around the corner as the glow from flashlights began to light up the far end of the hall. They would drag me back in there. Chain me up or take this thing back out of me before we could get away. If I was ever going to get out, it had to be now. The voice was singing again, pushing me to go further into the dark, to run until we were safe. So I listened and I ran. Every door unlocked for me, every turn kept me barely out of sight. The people looking for me were barking orders over a radio, asking someone what was the hold-up on the generator kicking on. Whatever the response, the hallways stayed dark as I drifted through them blind but not falling, lost but not being found. When I reached the final door, I opened it into a bright afternoon. My lungs burned a little at the first fresh, unrecycled air I had breathed in a week. Blinking, I waited for the voice to tell me where to go, but it had fallen silent. I closed the door as panic began to rise in my chest. All this and I would get caught because I didn't know where to go. I was outside a plain brown building in the middle of nowhere. There was a road going off to the right, and to the left there was Rachel's forest, from her first painting to me. I knew it was the same forest immediately, and not just because of it matching the paintings so closely. I had some strange sense that felt like a kind of magnetism, or how birds know which way to fly. Looking around for a second, I felt like I was being pulled when I looked again at those woods. This was right. Somehow, I knew this was the way I needed to go. So I went. I had made it to the edge of the forest when I heard the noise of men coming outside the building. I thought about hiding, but I knew it was a bad idea. They would just catch me, and I felt a drive to go deeper into the woods. I plunged ahead, running at close to a reckless speed but never tripping or stumbling as I went. I would occasionally hear a noise behind me as they spread out to search, but the sounds grew fainter as I ran. I almost thought I had lost them for good when I heard a short cough that was quickly muffled off to my left. Someone had gotten close without me knowing it. Panicking, I looked for any places I could hide. There were only bushes and trees and, over there, a well. Not just a well, but Rachel's well, with the same worn, gray stone walls capped with a weathered wooden lid. I felt a moment of happy recognition, but then it faded away. How did that help? They'd check the well if they found it, and I didn't have any way to get down in it without getting hurt or stuck. Then an idea struck me. Crouching low and staying to the brush, I moved to the well and gingerly pushed on the lid. At first it resisted, but when I pushed a bit harder, the wooden circle slid aside enough that you could clearly see someone moved it. Glancing around, I eased back into the bushes as I heard soft footfalls approaching. We need to check this out. You think he went down the well? Better hope not. He probably broke his neck if he did, and then it's our asses. I could see the two men approaching. Both of them were wearing dark body armor and carried assault rifles. The older of the two shrugged back at the other one. Better that than he was hiding in there and we didn't check. Looking irritated, the younger man nodded. I'll look. He went over to the well and shoved the wooden lid aside, causing it to clatter to the ground. Hitting a button on his rifle, a flashlight sprang to life on the barrel. He started to shine it down into the well as the other continued to look in every direction. I was worried he would see me if I moved, but I couldn't wait. I just had to stay calm. Think slow and move fast. I kept expecting to hear them yell, or feel something or someone strike me in the back, but nothing came. As the afternoon light began to dim, I saw the trees thinning ahead. I was approaching a road. It looked like a normal, public road too, with several cars passing one way or the other as I walked out of the forest and up the hill to the asphalt. The idea of hitchhiking, especially this close to where they held me, was frightening, but I saw little choice. I was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt they had given me and my own shoes, but I had no money or ID or phone. My only chance was to get far enough away that I could try and get help. I jumped slightly at the hiss of hydraulic brakes as a large semi rolled to a stop next to me. The passenger window rolled down and an older man with white hair and a graying mustache leaned over and peered down at me. You look lost, son. You need a ride? I looked down at the door of the truck. It had a logo that said Martinez and Sons Construction and Hauling. Below it was a cartoon man hitting a wall with a sledgehammer. Looking back up, I smiled at him. Yes, sir, I do. I woke up 5 hours later as we pulled into a truck stop somewhere in Nevada. I had planned on staying awake the entire trip, but that had only lasted a few minutes before exhaustion overtook me. I glanced over at Oliver Martinez and he gave me a toothy grin. I'm tired, but you were plumb tuckered out. I've got to fuel up, shower and get some grub. I'm going on to California after that. If you want to ride further, just be back here in an hour. Sound good? I nodded and thanked him again for the ride as I got out. I felt groggy from sleeping, but otherwise okay. I just needed to decide whether this was a good spot to ask for help or if I should ride with Martinez further. He seemed like a very nice guy, and he would probably try to help if he could, but I wanted to avoid putting more people in danger if I could help it. Looking around, I saw we were in a fairly nice little town. I decided I would go look around for a few minutes and then decide what to do. I was only 3 blocks down the street when I saw the flickering lights in the distance. It was a movie theater. As I got closer, I felt my chest tightening. It was the one from Rachel's painting. Hey there. Welcome to the Phoenix. The guy standing at the candy counter of the theater looked a little younger than me, and while he seemed friendly enough, he also looked slightly concerned. If you're here for the horror double feature, I'm afraid the second movie is about 30 minutes in. I can give you a half rate if you want to see it though. I shook my head and tried to not look as strange and crazy as I felt. No, that's okay. I recognize this place from a picture a friend of mine painted. So I came in to ask if you knew anything about her. He raised his eyebrows and shrugged. Okay, weird. He smiled and added, weird but interesting. Who is she? I swallowed. Her name is, it was, Rachel Donovan. I expected him to look surprised or excited or angry, but I could see right away the name meant nothing to him. Shaking his head, he shrugged again. Sorry, that doesn't ring a bell. I'd say you could ask the owner, but he's on vacation this week. Nodding, I searched my mind for something else to ask, some way to make this place matter the way her other paintings had. Is there anything unique about this place then? Its history or something? The man grinned. Buddy, you're clearly not from here. This place is super boring. Not just the theater, but the whole town. Frowning in thought, he added. The only thing I know about the history of this place is that there used to be a house here that burned down. This was like in the 1920s or 30s when this wasn't even a part of town. Couldn't tell you the first thing about it beyond that, but I still bet it's the most interesting thing that's ever happened here. I let out a disappointed sigh. Okay. Well, thanks. I turned to leave when the guy called out again. Hey man, sorry I couldn't help more. If you come back, I'll get you a discount on a movie. Half off. If I'm not working, tell them Marshall said it was okay. I waved and tried to smile as I headed for the door with a heavy heart. Why did you lead me here, Rachel? What's here that will help? I was outside again, staring up at the theater's bright blinking signs as though they were going to give me some kind of secret signal, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. There was an alley that ran alongside the theater and went behind it to something. Whatever was back there, the light of a distant security lamp cast shadows along the wall of the alley, and those shadows were moving. Instead of feeling afraid, I felt excited as I started down the alley. Rachel had led me here, and I just had to trust that there was a reason for it. Keep looking until I... The shadows were made by leaves blowing in some wind I couldn't feel. As I got to the far end of the alley, I saw there was a small backyard behind the theater surrounded by a chain-link fence, and on the other side of that fence was the tree from Rachel's painting, with its deep red twisting bark and foam of green leaves waving to and fro in the night air. I felt a surge of warmth in my chest as the distant singing began again. This was the place. The special tree that could not be found unless it wanted you to find it. It sat at the edge of a small overgrown lot surrounded on all sides by buildings and yards, somehow forgotten when whatever this land had once been was divided up, and despite its location, I had a strong sense that I was the first to see it in a very long time. Climbing the fence, I felt a jagged wire dig into my leg and rip my pants as I fell over the top. I was bleeding a little, but I hardly noticed. I could smell the tree now, and it was a rich, good smell unlike any I had smelled before. Reaching out to it, I felt the singing grow louder as I touched it. I felt stronger and less afraid then, and when I saw the light opening up at its roots, I didn't tremble, I smiled. There was a hidden tunnel under the tree. A tunnel filled with sweet-smelling air that was like the tree's smell but also different. And the tunnel wasn't dark, no, not at all. It glowed with its own golden light that called to me, urged me forward. Rain was beginning to fall as I looked around the dark lot. I had the thought that I was leaving this world behind. And I found I didn't mind that much at all. The tunnel had continued to grow, slanting down gently and tall enough that I walked in without stooping. The roots of the tree went on, woven through the dirt walls as I went deeper. I looked back and saw the tunnel had closed behind me, but I wasn't surprised. The way forward was the only way that mattered. I walked for what might have been hours, but I never felt tired or hungry. And I never worried I was lost, though I had no idea where I was or where I was going. Still, I felt a surge of happiness and excitement when I turned a corner and saw something in the tunnel ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a brick wall, but just as I began to think I had found a dead end, the wall faded away, revealing a dark room. I paused at the edge of the tunnel, looking out at the floor of what looked like a basement. It was empty, but in the light from the tree I could make out something scratched into the floor. It was the number 2. I felt my pulse quicken as I thought back to Rachel's painting with the theater seats, and then I stepped out into the room. It was the empty basement of a house, and as I went up the stairs and opened the door, I saw that the rest of the house was empty as well. No lights were on, but bright sunlight poured in through every window, and in the distance I could hear what sounded like small waves crashing on a beach. I wanted to go out and see where I was, but I forced myself to check the house first for any people or clues. But there were none. The house was utterly bare of any sign of people other than the number scratched into the floor below. My nose tingled with salty air as I stepped outside. The house was near the beach on what I soon figured out was a small, deserted island, and I realized with little surprise that I recognized the house from Rachel's painting. As I stepped off the porch, I saw no signs of people, but I wasn't entirely alone. Because sitting some distance from the house was the tree. I knew it couldn't be the same tree as in the abandoned lot, but at the same time I knew that it was. Or at least a different part of the same tree that made the tunnels and appeared in my old world in whatever place this was. Because I had started having that thought as soon as I stepped out of the house. I didn't think this was my world. Not exactly. I could see a larger island some distance away, and it might have people on it. Hotels and cars and planes. Or it might not, as those things might not exist here. Either way, my newfound intuition was growing stronger, and I could tell that what was it called? The texture of things was different somehow, if only a little. Not bad or scary, just different. Still, after a couple of hours exploring the island and checking the house, I began to feel terribly lonely, even with the tree nearby. I decided to go back into the tunnel and keep going. The basement wall faded away as I walked up to it, and I entered the tunnels again. It was only a short time later that I found my second version of the house. Much like the first, the wall faded away into a basement, but this one was far from empty. It was a workshop of some kind, full of tools I wasn't familiar with. I glanced down and saw 43 scratched onto the floor. Who was doing that? And why? I was going to explore the house, more carefully this time, as it looked like there were people here, but then I froze. Propped against the brick wall, next to a small stack of boards, was a sledgehammer. Trying to be quiet, I crept over and picked it up before heading back into the tunnel. When I was little, before Daddy died, he had loved to hunt. I never went with him and didn't remember much of what he hunted, but I do know he had an old hound he'd had since before I was born. The dog had only loved him and being on the trail of something. When Rocker, his name was Rockefeller, got a scent, it was like he was in a trance. He would go and go, this way and that, and to look at him, it looked like he was having a fit, both lost and certain at the same time. But whatever Rocker knew or didn't know, he always found what he was looking for. I felt like Rocker now. I was moving faster and faster as I went down this turn and nav. I felt like I was on the trail of something or traveling on memories I didn't have. Gripping the sledgehammer tightly, I could hear the rising hum of the distant music in my head as I turned the last corner, and then it fell silent. There was another brick wall, and as I approached, it fell away. It was another basement room, but this one was much smaller. It contained a table, a clothes chest, and an old metal bed that had been broken apart. At the far brick wall, a woman was using one of the metal legs from the bed to attack the wall and whatever lay behind it. I felt my head began to swim as I looked at her from behind, and as she turned to look at me, eyes wide with surprise and fear, I felt the sledgehammer slip from my grip as I stumbled back against the now solid wall. I could barely breathe at all, but I managed to get out a single word. "Rachel?" The woman looked at me, her expression less fearful but still guarded. She had the bed leg partially raised in warning. "Yeah. Do I know you?" It was her, but it wasn't, much like the tree on the island. This Rachel looked a few years older, and while she looked stressed and confused at the moment, her eyes didn't seem weighted down by the same quiet sadness I had come to recognize watching the other Rachel for all that time. Still, I didn't know how to answer her question and not sound creepy or crazy. I stared at her for a second, floundering, when she asked another. "You came out of the tree tunnel, right?" I nodded, grateful for something I could answer easily. "Studying me," she said. "Where did you come from?" "Before the tunnel, I mean." I flushed as I tried to think of the right words. I came from Texas. Originally, I mean." She grinned at me for a second before catching herself and trying to look serious again. "Yeah, okay. But do you know how the tree works? How did you find out about the tunnel? How did you get here?" Sighing, I rubbed my head and just started into it. "Look, I know this will sound crazy, but I had a job watching a woman trapped in a room, and that woman was you, or another version of you, and she asked me for help, and I couldn't help her and then they took me, And I found out she had been dead for a long time but could see me in the future, and then they put something from the tree in me that had been in her that killed her, and then I escaped, and then I figured out where to go to find the tree from things she had painted, and I somehow knew how to go in the tunnels to find different spots, and I'm pretty sure the tunnels lead to different worlds, and I got this sledgehammer, and then I... Hold up. God damn. Take a breath. You're going to pass out. She was smiling again, and this time she didn't try to hide it. She looked over what was left of the bed to where the sledgehammer was laying on the floor. And did you say sledgehammer? Whack. So yeah, I believe you. Whack. I've been in those tunnels too. My ex-boyfriend tricked me into moving here so he could tie me to the tree in his place. Whack. Well, not tie me to the tree literally. Take his place as, what? The tree's buddy or something? I don't really know. It's all pretty fucked up and I don't understand all of it. Whack. But what I do understand is that the fucker walled me up in here. At first, I thought I could just pry loose some bricks over time, but nope. He put a layer of concrete on the outside this time. Good ol' Phil. Or Justin. Or whatever. I mainly think of him as fuckface now. Whack. This is taking forever. I stepped up and put my hand on the sledgehammer. Let me do it for a bit. We can take turns. We had cleared away even more brick than she had already managed, but the concrete wall was only starting to show small cracks. I wanted to just keep looking at her, have her talk to me, but I knew she was tired. She nodded reluctantly and let go of the hammer. Before I swung, I looked back at her. How long have you been in here like this? Whack. Rachel scowled. It's hard to say for sure, but I think about 8 months. I let the hammer drop down again as my eyes widened. How did you survive all that time? Her scowl deepened. It's the tree. It won't let me die. I just dip into the tunnel every day for a bit and I never get that hungry or thirsty. A thought occurred to me then. Why didn't you just escape through the tunnels? She quickly shook her head. No, thank you. I've had enough of seeing other worlds. Some of them aren't so nice. And I don't want to be more tied to the tree than I already am. I just want out of here, into my own world, and then I can try and figure out how to get free of my connection to the tree for good. Rachel shrugged. I would have done it eventually with the stupid bed parts, but who knows how long it would have taken. She smiled again. I'm very happy you came to help and brought a sledgehammer with you. Returning her smile, I nodded as I lifted the hammer again. Me too. Whack. We were both wringing with sweat when we crawled through the hole we'd made in the outer wall. Rachel told me that she thought her ex-boyfriend was long gone, but she couldn't be sure, so we had to be careful. Grabbing the sledgehammer from inside the room, we made our way toward the stairs. The house was decorated but quiet, and we saw no sign of anyone as we walked to the front door and opened it. Outside, the sun was coming up on a new day, and as we walked out onto the porch, I jumped a little as Rachel took my hand and gave it a squeeze. I looked over at her. I hadn't been able to help the other Rachel, but maybe that had never been the point at all. Because I thought now she had been able to see more than just other places or the future. She had been able to see into other worlds and possibilities. Like this one, where another version of her was trapped and needed help. A place where I wouldn't be hunted and she could be free. In the end, even when she knew she was dying, Rachel had been determined to help us be together and happy. The morning sun painted beautiful colors on Rachel's face, and looking into her eyes, I saw how much she was like the woman I had watched and cared about and tried to save. The woman who, in the end, had saved me instead. I wanted to tell Rachel so many things, ask her so many questions, but all that could come later. Squeezing her hand back, I walked with her away from the house. For now, this was enough.
I've witnessed hell's invasion of the earth. It can be stopped. War is hell.
It's an old adage, but an accurate one. The death, loss, and suffering, which comes from violent conflict, touches everyone involved, civilians and soldiers alike, and on all sides of the dispute. No one walks away unscathed. Some wars are necessary, of course. Nations have the right to defend themselves against unprovoked aggression, and populations are sometimes justified in rising up against oppressive governments and dictators. Wars can result in acts of bravery and heroism that are unparalleled in human history, but they will also unleash some of our darkest impulses, unlocking primal instincts and justifying terrible acts of violence which would be considered murder in times of peace. But the many conflicts we've seen over the centuries all have one thing in common. They've all been fought between human beings. But the final war, if and when it comes, will be one for the survival of our species, as we come together to desperately resist the legions of hell. By now you've no doubt read the accounts of my predecessors, the history enthusiast who visited a secret museum telling the story of a future apocalypse, and the student who unwittingly stumbled into an alternate universe, attending a lecture charting hell's victory over Allied and Axis forces during World War II. And who am I, you might ask? Well, that's not really important. I wish to remain anonymous for my own reasons. But let's just say that I have a vested interest in these tales of hellish conquests and extinction events. Many will write them off as nothing more than scary stories on the internet, but I always believed there was more to it. I went out to seek the truth and I found it. A big part of me wishes I hadn't embarked on this dangerous quest. The acts of bloody violence and wanton slaughter I've witnessed, those appalling images will be burnt into my memory forever. But still, I alone have seen the full picture, and I'm here to tell you the truth. Yes, we are facing a terrible fight for survival, and sadly many will suffer and die. But the outcome of the final war is not inevitable, and we are not facing this threat alone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My fascination, or rather obsession, with the myth of the final war led me to some dark corners of the internet and far-flung places in my relentless search for clues. It was one of these hidden forums that led me to a unique living history tour, which one anonymous poster described as a life-changing experience. I recognized the code words, knowing how a similar post had led the history enthusiast to the hidden museum. And so, my curiosity got the better of me, and I took the bait. The location of the tour was marked by GPS coordinates. When I looked it up on Google Maps, I instantly had an eureka moment. The starting point of the tour was a field just south of Thiepval, on the banks of the River Somme in northeast France. This was, of course, the site of one of the bloodiest battles in human history, back during the blood-soaked summer of 1916, as Allied and German forces fought a horrific war of attrition in the muddy fields and trenches along a front line that barely moved in years. From my research, it seems that evil always enters our realm in these theaters of mass violence, using the blood and the darkness to their benefit, and drawing strength from the death and suffering to support their hellish invasion. This was the lead I'd been waiting for. I felt sure of it. I live in the UK, and so I travelled by car, embarking on the Eurotunnel shuttle from Folkestone to Calais, and driving east to the Somme. I felt an incredible poignancy as I drove through the French countryside en route to Thiepval, passing the numerous graveyards and memorials. So many thousands had lost their lives here, little over a century ago, churned up in the bloody inferno of industrial warfare. If I'd had the time, I would have liked to pay my respects to the dead, but sadly my mission was too important, and I couldn't afford any distractions. I arrived about half an hour before the tour was due to start. This was intentional, as I wanted to learn the lay of the land before all hell broke loose, if you'll excuse the pun. I parked up alongside a narrow and seemingly abandoned country road at the exact spot the GPS coordinates had led me to. The location was quiet and peaceful, the sun shining down upon a field of red poppies, a beautiful but poignant display, given the poppies' emotive symbolism and close connection to the terrible losses suffered during the Great War. There was no one around that I could see. I spotted a farmhouse about half a mile to the north and could make out the banks of the Somme on the western horizon, but there wasn't another living soul in sight. For a brief moment, I forgot why I was there, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air and listening to the birds singing. I opened the gate and walked out into the field, picking a poppy and holding it in the palm of my hand. It was peaceful, but this wouldn't last. He appeared in the corner of my eye, making me jump in fright. I turned to face the man who stood behind me. I knew he hadn't been there a moment before, and so his sudden appearance was disconcerting. Even though I'd been warned to expect such an event, the physical appearance of the man largely matched the descriptions in the previous accounts, as he appeared near identical to the museum curator and university lecturer. He wore thick reading glasses and a tweed suit, while sporting a tidy beard and short haircut. I don't know whether it's the same individual in every story. Probably not. The more likely explanation is this: the entity has chosen to assume the identity of a seemingly harmless academic type. In reality, of course, he's anything but. It's his eyes that give him away, however, filled as they are with a barely concealed malice. He smiled thinly as he spoke, calling out to me across the field and speaking in a polite but somehow also sinister tone of voice. "Good morning, sir. What a pleasure to meet your acquaintance." He marched across the field, the innate grin still on his lips as he held out his hand in an act of false friendship. I reluctantly shook his hand, not wishing to blow my cover at this early stage. A chill went through me as I touched his ice-cold palm and looked into his dark, hateful eyes. "Have you come far?" he asked, whilst maintaining his amicable pretense. "Yes, quite far," I replied, "but the drive was rather pleasant." "Oh, excellent, excellent," he replied enthusiastically. "Well, I see no reason for further formalities. An educated man such as yourself knows the lay of the land. So, shall we begin our tour?" His choice of words concerned me. I wasn't surprised that the tour guide was expecting me. Somehow, they always knew when we were coming. But did he know my true agenda? I certainly hope not, because this would place me in extreme danger. Even at this late stage, I considered turning on my heels and running back to my vehicle, but I'd come this far and knew I had to see this through. "Sounds good," I responded, noting the sly glint in the tour guide's eye and his cruel smile which never faltered. But there was a further twist in the tale to come. A moment later, and a second figure appeared by our side, seeming to materialize out of thin air. I looked upon what appeared to be an elderly woman, hunched over and walking with the aid of a stick. Her head was covered by a shawl, and she also wore a heavy winter coat, despite the fact it was a warm summer's day. She glanced across at me, smiling sweetly, and exerting a positive aura that was in stark contrast to that of the devilish tour guide. Her skin was wrinkled, but her eyes still retained a bright spark, and she surprised me by shooting me a sly wink. I was both shocked and concerned by the old woman's presence here. The previous accounts hadn't mentioned anything about a third party being present during the event. I worried that this vulnerable lady had unwittingly stumbled into this very dangerous situation. My anxiety only increased when I noticed the guide's reaction to her sudden appearance. I watched in dismay as his face turned red with rage and he angrily spat out his words. "And who are you? What the hell are you doing here?" His tone was very aggressive, but as it turned out, the old lady was more than a match for him. "Good sir, I will ask you to show some manners. I am a guest who wishes to join your tour. Is this not permitted?" she asked. "It is out of the question," the guide shot back,
I have my guest, and this tour is one-on-one. She glanced over at me, a spark in her eye as she said, I'm sure this gentleman won't mind if I tag along. What do you say, young man? My mind was racing. I didn't want the mystery woman jeopardizing my mission, but at the same time felt reluctant to offend her. I stuttered my reply, saying, well, not as such. But I didn't get the chance to finish my sentence as she cut me off abruptly. There, you see, it is not a problem. You'll hardly know I'm here. The guide still looked furious, glaring hatefully at the woman and then at me before he regained some level of self-control. Fine. He finally relented. But you must not interrupt my talk or interfere with the tour in any way. Otherwise there will be hell to pay. I recognized a threat when I heard it, but the lady didn't seem to notice the sinister undertone behind his words, merely nodding her head and replying, I'll be no trouble at all. Don't you worry, good sir. Very well. Then let us begin. The guide continued, whilst motioning out towards the poppy-covered fields. Welcome, guests, to this most solemn and sacred of sights. As you are aware, this location was the scene of one of the bloodiest battles of the 20th century. In the late summer of 1914, the European powers went to war, with an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia pitted against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The German High Command launched their Schlieffen Plan, mounting an invasion of Belgium and northeast France with the aim of capturing Paris and forcing the French out of the war. The German plan failed, however, as their armies were pushed back from the French capital, and a bloody war of attrition followed, with neither side able to make significant headway. Terrible weaponry was deployed: artillery, machine guns, poison gas. Casualties were horrific, and the blood-soaked, muddy, and rat-infested trenches soon turned into a hell on earth. During the summer of 1916, Allied forces launched their long-awaited offensive along the River Somme. The attack was preceded by a huge artillery bombardment lasting days. The British believed the German defenses couldn't survive such a heavy bombardment, but they were wrong. What followed was a bloodbath, one which ultimately resulted in 1 million casualties and made little change to the front. Right here where we stand, the British X-Corps pushed forward across no man's land on the 1st July 1916, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. On this ground, just over 100 years ago, thousands of men died under a rain of fire. It's hard to imagine such death and suffering occurred here, isn't it? Yes, I answered truthfully, as I cast my eyes over the tranquil fields. Time is a great healer, the old woman added. Well, time isn't something which concerns us here. We offer a unique experience, one which allows our guests to see and hear firsthand what war is really like. I stared at the tour guide in confusion, asking, What do you mean? The guide smiled sadistically and my heart froze, because I knew something bad was coming. But the trick that bastard pulled was really unexpected. All he had to do was click his fingers to turn the world upside down. I felt a surge of energy and was temporarily blinded by an intense light brighter than the sun. I fell down to my knees, covering my eyes behind my hands, and when I opened them again, I found myself in another place, or more accurately, another time. The poppy fields, trees, tidy fences, and farmhouse were replaced by a dead landscape of mud, barbed wire, and shell craters. The sun had risen on the far horizon, but there was no joy in this new morning. As soon as I surveyed my surroundings, my eardrums were almost burst by a series of almighty explosions, an unholy fire raining down from above. I looked to the east and saw the shells falling, the blast hitting the trench line and concrete bunkers. When I turned to the west, I saw the guns lighting up on horizon with a second trench line in front of them. To my horror, I realized we'd been transported back to July 1916, right in the middle of the battle. What's worse, The three of us were standing in no man's land between the British and German lines. I told myself it couldn't be possible, that this must be an optical illusion of some kind, but it all seemed so real. The mud beneath my feet, the thundering sound of the artillery barrage, and even the smell, the cordite, smoke, and awful stench of rotting corpses. I was understandably terrified because I'd suddenly found myself standing in the most dangerous spot on Earth, stuck between two industrial-age armies and their deadly array of weaponry. But when I looked to my mysterious companions, I saw they had no such fear. "Do not worry, sir," said the guide, this voice somehow audible even above the hellish din of the artillery. "You are quite safe as long as you stay by my side." I looked to the old lady for assurance as she seemed privy to whatever devilish trick the guide had pulled to bring us to this hellscape. "This man will lie to you about most things, but on this, he is telling the truth," she confirmed. I shook my head in dismay, my brain still unable to comprehend what was happening to me. I knew going in that this wasn't going to be easy and had fully expected to witness terrible things, but this was beyond my wildest imagination. I froze to the spot, suddenly realizing that the artillery bombardment had ended and an eerie silence had come over the battlefield. But of course, it didn't last. Then I heard the series of sharp whistles from the British trench line, and I watched on in horror as ladders were raised and helmeted. Tommies emerged, striding out into the killing fields. "My God," I swore, and tears rolled down my cheeks as I watched the tragedy unfold. "And here they come, lambs to the slaughter," said the tour guide, a sick smile across his face as he spoke. "Lions led by donkeys," the old lady added, a terrible sadness in her voice. The first wave of soldiers were barely out of the trenches before the machine gun fire began, a relentless barrage of bullets which cut human beings to shreds. Soldier after soldier fell, dropping dead or wounded in the mud and wire, their awful screams audible even above the heavy din of gunfire. But still they came, company after company of brave men throwing themselves into the breach, stepping over the bodies of their kinsmen as they pushed forward towards the German lines. We were literally standing in the middle of this living hell, watching as bodies fell all around us. But thanks to whatever black magic the guide had conjured, it appeared we were safe from harm. The soldiers on both sides weren't able to see us, and the bullets and shrapnel couldn't hurt us. There was death and devastation all around us, but it was like we were contained within some kind of protective bubble. But still, no man's land was a living hell, as young men continued to fall in a wanton slaughter, their fragile bodies torn apart by high-velocity bullets, and their blood and guts littering the battlefield. One young soldier fell only feet away from where I stood, dropping his rifle as a bullet pierced his chest. He looked up as he fell, his young eyes full of pain and fear. I swear he made eye contact with me for a brief moment before he took his final breath and left the mortal plane. The old lady walked up beside me and spoke into my ear. Such a sad thing to see a young life snuffed out so violently. He died alone and scared, so far from his home. What was his name? Where was he from? What were his hopes and dreams? Each death is its own individual tragedy, and there are so many. Her words moved me, but they clearly angered the guide. "Bah! Enough of this sentimental rubbish," he snarled. "War is war. And besides, the main event is still to come." I shot him a look, wondering what he meant, and all of a sudden everything stopped. The machine guns and artillery all ceased, and the advancing troops, those who were still alive, stopped in their tracks, simply standing still in the middle of no man's land. I felt concern, wondering what the hell was happening. Had a ceasefire been called? No, that couldn't be right. It didn't match the history I'd learnt. I had a terrible feeling deep in the pit of my stomach, knowing that something horrifying was about to occur. The ground beneath our feet shook, and I almost fell down into the mud. I looked to my companions and noted the sharp contrast in their expressions. The old lady's face was filled with sorrow, a look of sad resignation. Meanwhile, the guide was almost giddy as he watched the chaos unfold. Violence and death on this scale, this carnage always presents an opportunity for our forces. But of course, you already know this, don't you, sir? He winked at me in a frightening fashion, and I knew right then that he was on to me. I opened my mouth to speak but didn't get the chance to respond, as a moment later the two trench lines lit up in a fiery inferno. In a panic, I looked up into the morning sky and saw hundreds of fireballs descending, each the size of a car and each guided by an unseen force. They hit both the British and German lines simultaneously and with deadly precision, setting the trenches on fire and causing utter carnage. Our initial attacks are infinitely more successful than the artillery strikes, announced the guide, delving deep underground and incinerating men inside their bunkers. The mortals don't stand a chance. As if to emphasize his point, I heard the chilling cries of men being burnt alive, and my nostrils were filled with the foul stench of burning flesh. It was difficult to imagine a battle as brutal as the Somme becoming even more horrific, and yet this was what I was witnessing. I realized then that the demonic guide hadn't just transported me back in time, but also to another dimension, one where Hell's legions had chosen 1916 as their year of invasion. The fiery orbs always came first. I knew this from reading the previous accounts, but this wasn't the end of the assault. I turned slowly, seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. Glancing downwards, I was horrified to witness the dead soldier suddenly twitch and then move, his body brought back to life by a dark force. His joints cracked as he clumsily stood, his eyes dead and his jaw hanging open. He looked like some kind of meat puppet, held up by invisible strings, and for a brief moment or rather it, stood still, seeming to stare straight at me. When it charged, I screamed and my instincts told me to flee, but when I tried to run, the old lady grabbed my arm tightly, holding me back. I was surprised by how strong she was. "Don't," she ordered. "If you leave this circle, you will die." And she was right. The reanimated soldier ran right past us, instead sinking its teeth into another British Tommy, hungrily devouring a young man who may have been his friend only minutes before. I turned away in disgust from the gore, only to discover this gruesome scene was being replicated all across the battlefield, as thousands of British and German soldiers came back in a zombified state, launching savage attacks against the living. Former enemies became allies as they desperately fought back against the zombie hordes, firing rifles and machine guns, and ultimately fighting back using bayonets and rifle butts. But it was futile, as every time a man fell dead, he would immediately come back on the enemy's side. Soon, all of No Man's Land was dominated by the zombie hordes, and they hunted down the survivors in a bloodthirsty frenzy, tearing men to pieces with their bare hands and feasting upon their still warm flesh. I was horrified, dropping to my knees and vomiting in the mud, my whole body shaking as I felt like I was going to pass out. The old woman placed a delicate hand on my shoulder and spoke soothing words in my ear. There, young man. What we are witnessing is pure evil. But you are strong, and we can get through this together." The guide responded with cruel mockery, however, looking down upon me with utter contempt. "Oh dear sir, are you feeling poorly? All a bit too much for you, I suppose. Well, we're just about done at this location anyway. Time for a change of scenery. How about some sea air?" With that, he clicked his fingers for a second time, and I found myself transported to yet another time and place. I felt the sea breeze against my skin and sand beneath my feet. Looking across the sandy beach, I witnessed a heavily militarized coastline, with X-shaped tank traps and barbed wire, and with the cliffs above fortified with concrete bunkers and pillboxes. And then, I looked out to sea, reacting with shock as I witnessed a vast armada of warships and landing craft cutting through the waves and rapidly approaching the shoreline. The date, June 6, 1944. The guide stated, Omaha Beach, Normandy. After years of preparation, Allied forces launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France. The Allies enjoy a substantial superiority in the air and at sea, but the German coastal defenses are strong, and the first wave of infantry will be vulnerable. The supreme sacrifice those young men will make. The old lady added, traveling halfway across the world to fight against an evil regime, all in the name of liberty. We bear witness to heroics even in these dark times. They fight because they believe in something greater than themselves. The guide snarled at the woman, casting her a hateful look. The tension between the two was growing, and I feared how it would end. But there wasn't time to think about that now, as once again the chaos of battle took hold all around us. Shells flew over our heads, with Allied destroyers bombarding the shore fortifications and German 88 guns shooting back at them. Several of the landing craft were hit, exploding into fiery infernos, the GIs on board dying horribly before they even reached the beach. The next wave didn't fare much better. As soon as the craft reached the shore and the landing ramps came down, a heavy barrage of bullets from the German machine guns tore into the American soldiers, killing and wounding dozens in a matter of minutes. But still they came, advancing up the beach, using the metal obstacles for cover as they returned fire and slowly pushed towards the cliffs. Many men were dying before my very eyes, and it was a horrific sight, but I was also confused. I was thinking back to the student's account, the one who attended the lecture in an alternate, hellish realm. In that dimension, Hell's legions had invaded in late 1942, and so the D-Day landings had never taken place. So what was this? What was the guide subjecting me to? Was I seeing the Normandy invasion in my own timeline, or was this the history of yet another alternate dimension? I soon got my answer. My heart froze as the ground shook and the battle suddenly paused. I knew what was coming next. My attention was drawn to the cliffside, as suddenly the German pillboxes were struck by deadly fireballs and exploded into flames. Some of the American GIs cried out in triumph, apparently believing that their side had done the damage. But sadly, they were mistaken. I turned towards the English Channel and witnessed the sea boiling, waves rising as something huge and horrifying emerged from the depths. I knew what it was, having read the previous accounts. But hearing the stories could never have prepared me for seeing the beast firsthand. As I stood in shocked awe, the guide walked up beside me, sporting a sadistic grin as he confirmed what I already knew. The Leviathan, terror of the seas, no man-made vessel can withstand its deadly grasp. As if to emphasize his point, the creature raised its enormous tentacles above the surface, wrapping them around the nearest Allied warship. I could only look on in horror as the beast used its immense size and strength to crush the steel hull. I heard a terrible screeching sound of crushed metal and of sailors crying out in absolute terror. The beast slowly pulled the destroyer downwards, condemning its crew to a watery grave. Its terrible task done, the beast moved on to its next target, attacking a second warship with impunity. The GIs on the beach had stopped fighting as all now looked back towards the sea, unable to comprehend the horror they were witnessing. Some of the landing craft had made landfall while others were still on the water. The landing was already in disarray. But Hell's forces had yet another devilish trick up their sleeves. I saw movement underneath the water's surface, as yet unseen predators swam into position and prepared to attack. The first beast leapt up from the water, literally jumping into a waterborne landing craft and tearing into the men inside in a bloody massacre. It all happened so quickly that I hadn't gotten a good look at the monster, but hundreds more were coming, emerging from the depths to attack both the boats and the shoreline. The best way I can describe them is sea serpents, each at least 20 foot long and covered in thick green scales, their eyes a hellish shade of red, and their hideous maws filled with dagger-like fangs. The beasts attacked with a predatory instinct, swimming the shallow waters and slithering along the sands. Soldiers screamed as they tried in vain to mount a defense, but the serpents leapt upon them, swallowing men whole in a horrifying massacre. I turned away, closing my eyes and covering my ears. Once again, the old lady came to my aid. "Remember, young man, the so-called guide is a liar. You cannot trust what he shows you." I opened my eyes and raised my head, meeting her gaze as I shouted my angry reply. "But this has happened. It is history. Maybe not in my world, but that doesn't make it any less real." The woman smiled thinly, shaking her head. "The truth is not so simple, and there is always hope," she answered, pointing towards the cliff face. "Look." I glanced over to the end of the beach, amazed to see German and American troops combining forces, forming a defensive cordon and shooting down serpents, killing several as they held the line against all the odds. "Very admirable," the guide said, "but sadly futile." He nodded his head upwards, and I saw the monsters descending from the blue skies, merely dots at first, but then I made out their true form. Harpies, winged demons, red-scaled and armed with razor-sharp fangs and claws. Hundreds of monsters stealthily dived from above and launched their surprise assault upon the exposed human soldiers. I saw the massacre coming and cried out a warning, forgetting for a moment that these men could neither hear nor see me. The guide cackled cruelly as the winged beasts tore into their prey, ripping bodies apart in a sickening bloodbath. For all their bravery, these men couldn't withstand this combined attack, and soon the serpents and harpies slaughtered them in their hundreds, the foul beasts fighting each other as they hungrily devoured their victims. Once again I turned away in disgust, not wanting to meet the old lady's eye because I knew she'd lied to me. She also remained silent, and so it was left to the demonic guide to speak next. "Well, I think we've seen enough. Time to move on to our next location." Another click of his fingers and a blinding flash, and we were shifted to yet another hellish alternate dimension. The first thing that hit me was the stifling heat and the thick air, a humidity which made me sweat and struggle to breathe. I opened my eyes and found myself surrounded by a dense tropical forest, tall trees towering above us, and a thick vegetation crudely cut back by human hands. I realized then that the guide had transported us to a different continent, as well as time and dimension. We were now in the tropics and witnessing a very different type of conflict. In most dimensions, the Second World War ends with the Allies victorious. The guide calmly explained, but soon after, a Cold War breaks out between the United States and Soviet Union, as an Iron Curtain descends and the world is divided between the communist and capitalist blocs. The advent of nuclear weapons makes all-out conflict unlikely, as neither side wants to risk triggering an apocalypse. This development frustrates my master's objectives, but there are still opportunities in the chaos, as the two superpowers vie for control and influence across the globe. This results in brutal proxy wars such as this, unconventional conflicts, but no less brutal and bloody. He paused briefly, waving his hand to draw attention to our surroundings. Welcome to Indochina, 1968. America has poured in vast numbers of troops and firepower in an attempt to defeat the communist insurgency, but their war effort is frustrated by the tenacity of the guerrilla forces. A bloody stalemate ensues and, as always, we are ready to step into the darkness. Our attentions were drawn to the skies above as I heard the recognizable drone of rotor blades and spotted the Huey troop-carrying helicopter descending, noisily making landfall in the rice paddy field where we stood. The powerful gust of hot air hit me, and the intense sound of the rotor blades spinning blocked out all other sounds. We watched as a squad of 8 heavily armed U.S. infantrymen jumped out from the chopper's side door and set up a defensive perimeter on the edge of the field, their weapons facing out towards the tree line. And then the helicopter ascended, slowly pulling up from the field and back into the blue skies, whilst leaving the troops behind to perform their mission. The soldiers couldn't see us, of course, but we were able to observe them at close quarters as they formed up and began their designated patrol into the jungle. We followed after the men, remaining inside of our protective bubble thanks to whatever dark magic the guide had evoked, but still exposed to the sights, sounds, and smells of the tropical forest, and of course the stifling, exhausting heat. I could tell how tense the soldiers were under the circumstances, twitching at every rustle of leaves, whispering about ambushes and punji traps. This was the frightening reality of counterinsurgency warfare, where an attack could come from anywhere at any time, and there were no clearly defined front lines. We hadn't walked for long before we reached a clearing, casting our weary eyes upon a small village of bamboo huts, and my nostrils were again hit by the foul stench of death. We watched as the American soldiers discovered the first body, followed by another and another. The squad would have descended into blind panic had it not been for the stern orders of their sergeant. "Keep your shit together, boys," he boomed. "We still have a job to do. Watch the tree line and look out for booby traps." His men reluctantly obeyed orders, but the panicked conversation continued as more bodies were found. We saw what they saw, and I was sickened by the carnage. Clearly, the dead weren't Viet Cong fighters, but rather unarmed civilians, old men, women, and children. Not only that, but their bodies were badly mutilated, torn apart, leaving blood and entrails scattered across the forest floor. There were seemingly no survivors, as even the village's livestock, goats and chickens, had been similarly slaughtered. It was sickening. We listened to the troops' hurried chatter as the situation grew even more tense. "What the fuck? Did Charlie do this?" one young private asked. "Maybe, although I've never seen a massacre like this," replied the sergeant. "I don't think humans did this," chirped in another man. "Look at the bite marks on the bodies. It looks like an animal attack to me." "That's crazy," answered the sergeant. "No animal could do this." But he didn't sound too sure. There was a terrible atmosphere in the air as the soldiers held a silent vigil over the dead. It seemed certain that something bad was about to occur, and so it was hardly a surprise when the attack was launched. A man screamed, pointing to the deep undergrowth as a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the shadows. There followed a deep, animalistic growl, and then bloody chaos. A beast moved rapidly out into the open, a blur of fur and teeth that pounced upon the nearest soldier before he could react. The man screamed, firing his M16 blindly into the air as he was knocked down and then mauled in a gruesome manner, the beast tearing into his chest and ripping out his heart. The rest of his squad reacted with shock, as nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for this. "Contact!" the sergeant cried, as he raised his rifle and fired. "Holy shit! They're everywhere!" screamed another man. And sure enough, several more of the hellish beasts emerged from the surrounding forest, launching savage attacks at lightning speed. The remaining soldiers fired wildly in all directions, but the creatures moved so rapidly that they couldn't get a fix on them. I could only watch on in abject horror as man after man got cut down in a frenzied assault. One soldier's head was sliced off with a single swipe of a claw, while several others were dragged into the forest, still screaming frantically as they clawed at the dirt in a futile attempt to escape. The sergeant was the last man standing, and he managed to shoot and wound one of the beasts before two others grabbed him from both sides, using immense strength to rip his arms from their sockets. It was only then that I got a good look at the creatures as they finished the slaughter and feasted upon the flesh of their newest victims. They were werewolves, half man, half canine. Their eyes burning a demonic red, and their blood-filled maws filled with razor-sharp teeth. I had heard mention of such creatures in the previous accounts, but nothing could have prepared me for seeing them in the flesh, or for the speed and savagery of their attack. Soulless, savage beasts, the old lady muttered as she came by my side. They do not discriminate in their victims and belief in nothing. Their only desire is to satisfy their unrelenting hunger and bloodlust. "You're wrong," the guide shot back angrily. "It is true that our shock troops do not discriminate. Capitalist or communist, soldier or civilian, their flesh all tastes the same. But these beasts do serve a higher purpose. They are loyal to their master, and his goal is clear, to destroy mankind and gain dominion over the earth. In this, he will succeed." "I wouldn't be so sure of that," the old lady replied cryptically. The two bizarre individuals glared at each other for a long moment, as the werewolves continued to feast on dead men. I could tell the passionate hatred they held for each other, and for a second feared that violence would ensue. But then the guide broke the silence, speaking with the same cruel smile etched across his lips. "Well, I guess further proof is required, even after everything we've seen. But that's okay. I have a special surprise in store for our guest." He stared at me with his evil eyes, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Sir, you are an Englishman, are you not?" he inquired. "Yes," I replied nervously, fearing where this was going. "Very good," the guide continued. "Let's take a glimpse at your country's near future." Another flash of light, and suddenly I found myself in my home city of London, standing on that I believed was Oxford Street, but it was not the busy shopping district I remembered. England's capital had been transformed into a post-apocalyptic hellscape, with the streets abandoned, shop fronts smashed open and looted, and the skyscrapers and historical buildings burning. "Welcome home," the guide sneered with a perverse satisfaction. "Not quite as you remember it, I expect. The year is 2020-something. Well, why ruin the surprise? Now watch." I felt a rage building up inside me as I clenched my fists. I wanted to beat the bastard bloody, but the old lady stopped me. "Keep your cool, young man," she cautioned. "Don't let him provoke you. This will all be over soon." I was still angry and frightened, but events were playing out in front of my very eyes. At the far end of the street was a barricade manned by a platoon of British soldiers, most armed with SA-80s, but some carrying Javelin anti-tank missile launchers. The infantrymen were supported by a Challenger main battle tank which blocked off the street. I guessed these troops were mounting a last-ditch defense, but from what? I soon got my answer. The ground shook beneath our feet, and I heard a loud thumping on the asphalt, a thunderous booming sound which grew ever louder. Suddenly, a huge creature smashed through one of the ruined buildings, emerging onto the previously empty street. I looked up, horrified to see a demon 50 to 60 foot tall, with the horned head and hoofed feet of an animal, but the body of a man, adorned in thick steel armor. Its eyes burned a fiery red, and it opened its huge mouth to reveal rows of shark-like teeth. The beast emitted a terrifying roar which filled the air, and it charged down the street towards the troops, the ground shaking underneath its huge hooves. The soldiers opened up with every weapon at their disposal. The rifle rounds had no effect, merely deflecting off the demon's armor like pebbles bouncing off a metal sheet. But then the Challenger opened fire with its main cannon, producing an almighty boom. The shell was propelled across the void and smashed into the demon's armor-plated chest. The heavy projectile stopped the monster in its tracks. It roared in pain and anger, but the shell didn't bring him down. instead only temporarily delaying its advance. What happened next was either the result of great skill or a total fluke. A javelin missile soared through the air and hit the charging demon directly in its left eye. The projectile tore through the soft tissue and exploded inside the demon's brain. The monster was killed instantly, its huge frame falling and crashing down onto the street only yards away from where we stood, the sheer weight of its enormous body cracking the concrete beneath it. The soldiers cried out in triumph, and I shared their elation. From what I'd read in the previous accounts, these Goliath-like demons were thought to be virtually indestructible, but what I'd just seen proved they could be killed. But then I remembered something else from the stories, that these demons always fought in threes. The second demon suddenly emerged at the far end of Oxford Street, raising a crossbow-like weapon to its shoulder and firing. A bolt tore through the air as fast as any man-made missile, smashing into the tank and tearing through its thick armor, reducing the high-tech war machine to a flaming wreck. The surviving soldiers were left in disarray, as suddenly the third demon stomped down the street from behind them, roaring with fury as it swung its huge, fiery sword. I could only watch in abject horror as the demon killed a half-dozen troops at once, slicing them in half and staining the footpath with blood and gore. The survivors broke, fleeing in all directions whilst firing wildly at their giant attackers. I doubted they would get far. "Well, that's the end of that," the guide said, with the same cruel smirk on his face. He pointed to the entrance of the tube station across the road. "The rats always flee underground at times like this. Let's take a look." He began walking across the rubble-strewn tarmac, ignoring the monstrous demons as they picked off the remaining soldiers one by one. I didn't follow straight away, instead looking to the elderly woman for reassurance. "It won't be easy," she explained. "But you need to see this. It's too late to turn back now, young man." I nodded my head, and we proceeded across the street, following the guide down the stairs to the station below ground. Once we'd passed through the smashed-up turnstiles, we witnessed yet another horrifying scene, perhaps the worst yet. There were a few other soldiers down here, a mix from different regiments and even some armed Met police officers. They all appeared exhausted and terrified, but still maintained a loose cordon along the station's platform. But the true horror was behind the armed men and women, several hundred civilians, men, women and children, all huddled together along the platform. I looked into those faces and saw nothing but fear and pain. All were dirty and emaciated refugees in their own country, seeking sanctuary underground, since the enemy now controlled the streets above. The London Underground had served as a refuge before, back in the dark days of the Blitz during World War II. But now the displaced Londoners were hiding from an enemy more evil than even the Nazis. We walked across the platform, unseen by the military personnel and huddled refugees. An officer was screaming into a radio, desperately pleading for outside assistance. There was nothing I could do but listen. "God damn it, man," he shouted. "I have over 500 civilians down here. We need an immediate evacuation." "I'm sorry, Colonel," came the sheepish reply from the other end. "No helicopters are available. There's nothing we can do." "I won't accept that," the colonel screamed. "Let me speak with your superior officer." "Hold, please," came the nervous reply. A tense pause followed before the static was replaced by a new voice, a female voice, confident but also exhausted. Her tone indicated immediately that it wasn't good news. "Colonel, this is your Prime Minister speaking." The officer's eyes bulged, and he visibly gulped before responding. "Ma'am?" "I'm very sorry, Colonel," she continued. "This is the most difficult decision a leader will ever have to make, and I thought I owed it to you. To tell you in person." There was a tense pause, as it seemed the politician was struggling to find the words. "My military advisors tell me there is no other alternative. I have authorized Operation Holy Fire. Trident has been deployed, I am so sorry, Colonel. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. And with that, the radio call was abruptly ended. The Colonel was in a state of shock, still holding on to the receiver as he looked upon the huddled refugees, his eyes wide with horror. And I understood why. Trident meant nuclear weapons. The British government had decided to nuke their own capital. That's what it had come to. What madness, what desperation had led them to this place. Mercifully, there wasn't long to wait before the terrible end. A thunderous boom and a wall of fire, and the ceiling collapsed, burying hundreds of screaming civilians and soldiers under tons of debris. I fell to my knees, covering my eyes and ears in a futile attempt to drown out the horror. But it was all over almost as quickly as it had begun, and the smug guide transported us back to the present day. I found myself curled up in a ball on the platform of Oxford Circus tube station, the guide, an old lady, standing over me as puzzled commuters pushed past us. "Are you all right, mate?" asked one man, as he looked down upon me with concern. I quickly composed myself, wiping the cold sweat off my forehead as I stood up on my shaking legs. "Yes, I'm fine," I answered sheepishly, although in reality I was anything but. I'd been dragged through hell and back, but I knew this wasn't over. I looked to my two companions, but found they were almost oblivious to my presence, glaring at each other across the crowded platform. "Time to end this," the guide snarled through clenched teeth. "Agreed," the woman replied, "but not here." "Fine," the guide answered before he clicked his fingers again. Another flash of light, and we went to another place. In an instant, I was hit by a freezing cold wind that chilled me to my bones. Looking around, I saw we were now stood upon a frozen mountain, with nothing but white snow in every direction. My teeth chattered, and my whole body shook uncontrollably as the guide spoke. "The Watkins Range, Greenland. Nothing much has ever happened here, but it is isolated and far away from curious eyes, and so will serve our purpose." I continued to shiver, wondering how I could survive this intense cold. The old lady broke eye contact with her adversary, looking down upon me with sympathy in her eyes. To my shock, she removed her heavy coat, revealing the frail body underneath. "Here you go, young man," she said, whilst holding the coat out to me with her bony hand. I shook my head and muttered through my blue lips, "I can't." No matter how cold I wasn't going to deprive an 80-year-old woman of her winter coat. "Trust me," she replied with a kind smile. "You need it more than I do." Somehow I believed her, and I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth, so I took the coat and put it on, savoring the warmth and protection it offered. "Very touching," the guide mocked. "You're quite the guardian angel, aren't you?" "I do what I can to bring some small comfort," the lady replied, whilst fearlessly meeting the guide's eye. "You bloody bitch," he spat out hatefully, this face turning red with fury. "You think I don't know who you really are? I clocked you as soon as I saw you." "How very perceptive of you," she replied sarcastically. This only added to the guide's anger. "What the fuck are you doing here?" he shouted. "I'm here to stop you." She responded firmly, without missing a beat. He laughed in cruel mockery before answering. "You still don't get it, do you? We will win. Earth will fall and humanity shall perish. That's inevitable. In every timeline we will ultimately emerge victorious." The woman smiled faintly before delivering her rebuttal. "Nothing is inevitable. The future is not set in stone, and whatever evils your master has perpetrated can be undone. You will not win." "Enough talk," the guide screamed, his eyes bulging with rage. "Let's settle this." And then hell really did break loose. The first thing I noticed was the guide's eyes turning a hellish shade of red, and then the horns which suddenly extended from his forehead. His white teeth become fangs and his body grew at an impossible rate, as his height doubled, then trebled. And it didn't stop there. I stepped back, looking up in horrified awe as our former guide transformed into one of the Goliath-like demon foot soldiers, close to 60 foot tall, his hooves buried deep in the snow. He roared at a deafening volume, so loud that I feared he might cause an avalanche, but instead, he produced a huge sword, easily 3 times the length of a man. The hideous weapon burned red with a fiery intensity, suddenly heating up the otherwise freezing environment. I was horrified to witness the so-called guide in his monstrous true form, a soldier of hell ready to do battle. But I wasn't his target. The beast's focus was the old lady, and, on paper, it couldn't have been a greater mismatch. But the elderly woman wasn't as she appeared either. When I glanced back in her direction, I saw she was changing too, turning into a much younger and stronger woman, her hair silver and eyes a striking shade of deep blue. Her body grew too, and soon she towered over me. But that wasn't all. I watched in astonishment as the woman extended a pair of huge wings from her back, flapping them smoothly as she rose up from the snow-covered ground. And then I finally understood. The woman wasn't human. She was an angel. My guardian angel in disguise, protecting me this whole time. Her former walking stick became a sword of white light, almost as long as I was tall. At her full height, she was at least 12 foot tall, but still dwarfed by the giant demon opposing her. I didn't know how she could win this fight, but my angel was full of surprises. The demon roared once more, charging across the snow as the whole mountain shook beneath his huge hooves. He swung his mighty sword with brutish strength, attempting to slice the angel in two. But while he had the size and strength, she had the speed and agility. The angel flew out of the path of the fiery sword, deftly avoiding the killer blow. The demon roared in frustration as it pulled its sword out of the snow, but the angel had already launched her counterattack, soaring in low and cutting her enemy across his thigh, slicing deep into his exposed flesh. The monster cried out in pain, angrily swinging its sword in her direction, but once again she dodged the blow and struck back. This routine was repeated several times over, with the demon thrashing out and the angel avoiding the blows before launching her own small attacks, cutting the beast repeatedly on his chest, arms, and legs. I guess she was trying to kill the demon through 1,000 cuts, gradually draining his strength and bleeding him out. It was a good strategy, but her luck didn't last. The angel was a fraction too late as the fiery sword came down upon her. She managed to parry the heavy blow with her own sword, but the sheer force of the strike knocked her out of the sky, throwing her body backwards as she hit the ground hard. I gasped in horror, looking to the spot where my guardian angel had fallen and silently begging her to get up. But it seemed like she was incapacitated. The demon sported a sadistic grin, showing his shark-like teeth as he raised his mighty sword and went in for the kill. I feared it was all over. But at the last possible second, the angel opened her eyes and moved. The demon's sword was harmlessly buried in the snow as the angel darted upwards, extending her sword and screaming with a righteous fury as she soared upwards, acting like a missile homing in on its target. She hit the demon square in the chest, stabbing him right where his heart would be. The monster cried out in agony, its huge frame suddenly falling backwards as the angel withdrew her sword from his flesh, letting the monster's red blood spill over the pure white snow. The demon landed heavily on the mountainside, the sheer weight of its immense body shaking the ground underneath him. But the mortally wounded monster would transform once again in its dying moments, changing back into its human form. The guide lay inside the huge crater, his heart pierced as he bled heavily. The angel and I ran to his side, getting there just in time to hear his final words. The demonic entity laughed, even as he choked on his own blood. "You think this is over?" he spluttered, his eyes still full of hatred as he glared up at us. You think you've won, but you're wrong. My master will not stop. He will continue the fight. And we will be ready for him, the angel replied defiantly. The guide tried to speak again, but instead the blood poured from his open mouth, and he closed his eyes for the last time. I breathed a deep sigh of relief, although was still in a state of shock after witnessing the violent struggle. The angel sheathed her sword and smiled at me sympathetically, her eyes now filled with kindness. Come on, young man. Let's get you home. There followed a flash of light, and suddenly I was back where it had all started, the poppy field in northeast France, in the current day, and my own timeline. I looked to my companion and saw she had returned to her previous form, that of an elderly, frail, and seemingly harmless lady. She held out a hand expectantly and said, "My coat, please." I gladly removed the garment and handed it back to her, although I wouldn't soon forget the warmth and comfort the coat had offered me in my time of need. I watched as she put the garment back on to cover her frail form, although I now knew this was merely a facade. "I am grateful to you," I said nervously, "but there is so much I still don't understand." She smiled at that. "You understand more than you think. You came here looking for answers and you found them. The threat posed by the legions of hell is very real, and someday, perhaps someday soon, they will launch their invasion of your world. The conflict will be brutal and bloody, and sadly many will perish. But the outcome is not inevitable. You are not alone in this fight, and together we can triumph against evil. You just need to keep the faith." She paused, looking out over the fields and pointing towards the bright sun on the far horizon. "Even here there is beauty, after all the suffering and death that once occurred where we stand. There is always hope for a brighter future. Remember that, young man." I looked to the horizon briefly, and when I turned back the woman was gone, leaving me alone in the field with my thoughts. So, there you have it, good people, my story in its entirety. It's far-fetched, and many of you may not believe it, but I swear my account is the truth. I'm telling you all this to back up my predecessors and also to pass on the warning. War is coming, but all is not lost. There is much darkness in this world, but there is also light. And they say the night is always darkest before the dawn. Godspeed, my friends. Memories of the graveyard shift. I was 18 at the time. I'd just graduated high school, and what was probably a really exciting and memorable time for most people was a stressful race against time for me. You see, my dad was very traditional. If I were going to be living in his house after high school, even just over the summer between graduation and college, I needed a job. If not, I was freeloading, and he swore with an adamance I certainly didn't care to test that I'd be out on the street if I was unemployed for long. I'd had months of preparation, hell, years really. This entire time I could have been looking. He certainly hadn't waited until now to clue me in on the terms of living with him after high school. But I just wasn't the type to care that much about anything until I was days from a deadline. Finding a job back then wasn't easy. I dyed my hair green, and my nose and lips were pierced, not to mention the gauges and the shitty stick and poke snake on my forearm that my 16-year-old self had afflicted upon me. Case in point, I wasn't getting hired most places, and being that I had about a week at the time left to figure it all out, like usual, I was in a mad scramble to line something up before facing the consequences. But then, as if some morbid miracle, a cop got shot and killed on 84th Avenue pretty close to the pass and go out there, and an opening for the night shift position appeared not long after. The pass and go and 84th Avenue as a whole had a pretty bad reputation. See, 84th was one of the only roads in town still unpaved at parts, namely the north end shortly after the pass and go, and it wound along a pretty deep drainage ditch, where no guardrails had ever been built, even after decades of complaints. There was a particularly tight bend up the road where a lot of drunk drivers and speeding teens learned that they were not in fact invincible, some of them even taking that lesson to the grave with them, and the lack of streetlights just made it all the more dangerous. But those were just the logical concerns. In a tiny town like mine, people are bored enough to run with sensational bullshit, and so 84th could never just be a dangerous road with poor construction and lack of safety measures to blame, but was instead cursed and haunted. People died there so often not because it was just a hazardous roadway, but because it was bloodthirsty, evil. People's reception went out on the road not because it was essentially the furthest you could be from town, but because some malicious entity wanted you isolated. You get it. The woods beyond the ditch were even worse. On 3 occasions since the turn of the century, bodies were found out there, 1 a suicide, and 2 in shallow graves. And in a town as small as mine had been, that's a pretty sizable number. For a criminal, though, it only made sense to bury them there. Again, this place was basically abandoned and totally secluded. Really, the only other people that far northwest of town were the wages at the pass and go, and they weren't getting paid enough to be on the lookout for anything. Not to mention, they had their own weirdness to deal with. All sorts of strange and illegal activities happened in that pothole-ridden parking lot. And why wouldn't it? That place was the last beacon of humanity's presence in the town for miles, until you got to 90th Street, the main road shooting off from the highway. So anybody working there had enough going on at their own doorstep, and wouldn't be paying any attention to cars pulled off on the side of the road, with mysteriously heavy duffel bags in the trunk. Suffice it to say, once the position opened, I was the only person in town out of options enough to drop off an application. And wouldn't you know it, I was scheduled to start 2 days later. I picked it up quick. The job was easy, and though at first I was shadowing a guy that by all accounts could have been undead, I was left to my own devices a week later. To be honest, I actually kind of liked the job at first. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. were pretty standard hours of consciousness for me anyway, and working the graveyard shift finally gave me an excuse to sleep in until 3. It was dead most nights. Sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, I literally didn't see a single customer. And other nights, the goofiness of my interactions with various druggies kept things interesting. But those kinds of nights aren't what this story is about. The first time I remember being pretty confused was only 2 weeks after I'd started the job. I was pretty stoned at the time, so I tensed up when I saw a cop walking toward the door, but I wasn't complacent enough to blaze it before work without eye drops, for fear of these exact situations. Not so much worried about getting arrested, but about what my dad would do to me. I also had a little bit of a heads up in the form of a faulty open sign in the window. The neon would pretty often flicker or dim for some reason when people were coming up to the door. Really couldn't tell you why it happened. But when I was totally fucking off behind the counter, it was my cue to act natural for a minute. And since a bunch of random bullshit was stacked up on the side of the counter to my left, facing the parking lot and the pumps, I couldn't ever see out the windows unless I was actively looking over it. So needless to say, whatever was wrong with that sign certainly wasn't something I was going to try and get fixed. When the cop walked in, I sort of leaned back as casually as possible and tried to make small talk with him so his mind wouldn't wander anywhere else. "See any crazies?" I inquired. "Not yet," he answered, perusing the energy drinks like a selection of fine wines. He sounded pretty bored, and I hoped that that wasn't an indication that he was looking for something to do. "Well, lucky you," I chuckled. "Can't say the same myself." "Yeah?" He settled on a sugar-free monster. He walked over to the counter, and I remember thinking he was either a new guy or one of those officers that just never stopped being motivated, going off his short hair and fresh fade. Though judging off how young he looked, definitely early 20s, I was going with the former. These were the worst types of cops from my experience. They're always looking for a way to stand out to their higher-ups. Yeah, I continued. Saw a lady sleeping in a shopping cart out back. Asked her why the shopping cart, and she said she learned from a TV show that you should never sleep on the bare ground. You learn something new every day, I smirked. That actually happened last week, but who's counting? Pfft, he actually smiled slightly. Weirdos, man. Yeah. Will that be all? Yeah. $3.29. He tapped his card on the reader, and while the sale processed, I remember actually feeling slightly concerned for the guy. I wasn't a big fan of cops, but one of them had died around here recently after all, and just talking with this guy face to face sort of humanized him to me. As he cupped the top of the drink and slid it off the counter, I said, "Stay safe out there." He glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. You know something I don't? Nah, just, that cop that got shot out here a couple weeks ago. Huh? I just stared at him. Listen. He peered at my name tag for a second. Carter, you can't believe everything you hear about this place. 84th Avenue. It's just a street, man. Most of what you hear about this place is embellished or even totally made up. Yeah, all right. Well, have a good night, officer. I paused, squinting at his name tag back. Brady. He walked off into the night, his energy drink in his hand. At the time, I didn't give that interaction a whole lot of thought. I learned most of my news from memes, and it was definitely possible I'd been wrong. Unlikely, but possible. But over time, stranger things began to occur. And I'm not talking about druggies sleeping in shopping carts. I began to pick up on an anomaly with the neon sign. See, it actually didn't flicker very often. It seemed to at first, but after getting caught off guard multiple times by random people coming in, I realized I couldn't trust it as much as I thought I could. Yet strangely, though it seemed inconsistent, I realized it always blinked and dimmed for certain people. There was this lady that would come in about once a week and buy a scratch-off ticket. I figured she had to be pretty depressed, 'cause she was always wearing the same clothes and was coming to this dingy-ass place with relative frequency. Every time she'd ask for the same ticket, Cash Kaiser, and every time I'd slide it to her, she'd smile at me and say, "Maybe tonight's the night." Even in her voice, I could hear how much she needed a break. But I guess tonight was never the night, 'cause a week or two later, she'd always be back, always dressed the same, always buying a colorful strip of false hope that things would suddenly change for her. I tried to chat with her the more she came in, but she wasn't keen on giving away details about her life. She was mostly unresponsive, just nodding or giving me one-word answers, and then she'd head out in kind of a hurry. But her clothes weren't the only thing that stayed the same every time. Every single time she came into the pass and go, that sign would flicker. Now I could have just been reading into things too much. I wondered if the sign was ultimately connected to a wire through the ground maybe, and maybe certain people were stepping over it, and those people just kind of came in the same way every time. I didn't really know. I'm not an electrician. But the sort of Groundhog Day that transpired every time she stopped by really did intrigue me. Then one night in early July, I had another curious experience. I was listening to some podcast about ayahuasca and contemplating if I'd ever take the plunge when the green flicker of my inconsistent early warning system caught my attention. And when my eyes trailed from the neon sign and over the merchandise on the counter to the pumps out in the dark beyond, I saw a guy pumping gas into his truck, probably in his mid-30s. He had this really gruff look on his face, but I wouldn't have paid it much mind except for the fact someone was with him, a girl about my age. While he was by the pump, she was heading into the store. She had black hair down to about her shoulders, and these big brown eyes. Her skin was kind of pale, like she probably didn't get out much, and she wore skinny jeans and a gray top. As soon as I noticed her approaching, I stepped back from the window. I definitely didn't want to creep her out by being seen peeking over the counter through the glass. She came in, and as the chime above the door rang, I couldn't help but glance at her as she beelined to the snacks. She was cute, and I was considering flirting with her at first, but then I glanced over the counter again at the guy in the parking lot, presuming him to be her big brother or dad or something. I didn't want to piss him off, so I decided to keep it casual. She was over by the coolers on the back wall the next time I found her, not looking my direction while she scanned our selection of sports drinks. Then she grabbed a red Gatorade and came walking up to the front. She put the drink and a bag of classic Lay's on the counter, and when I noticed it was almost 4 a.m, I couldn't help but inquire, "What's got you out so late?" I was scanning the items with muscle memory, my eyes meeting hers after she glanced at the counter for a second as if considering a response. "Nothing really." "Big bro?" I flicked my eyes to the guy in the parking lot, and at this her nose wrinkled. "Ew." Number, I thought that was a strange response. "Ew?" I asked as the total popped up on the screen. "It's gross to have a brother?" "It's gross to kiss your brother." She smiled flatly, and I didn't want to seem creepy, but I couldn't help but get on the tip of my toes for a second and peek at him again. No doubt the guy was in his 30s, and if I had to be more specific, I'd be leaning more toward late 30s than early. He was wearing boots, jeans, and a blue and brown flannel, and had a 5 o'clock shadow I could see from the store. The more I looked at him, the more weirded out I felt. But then again, none of this was my business, and I didn't want to pry. She definitely didn't seem to be with him against her will. "Ah, gotcha," I smiled, but the whole thing felt unignorable off to me as she handed me a 10. "You guys going on a road trip or something?" "Something like that." There was this turbulent mix of emotions in her eyes. And while she looked excited, definitely thrilled about something, she also kind of seemed to be longing too. I only got a glimpse of it, though, as she unexpectedly asked, "You ever just do something totally crazy, like overnight?" "I mean, I took a heroic dose of shrooms once on a whim without a trip sitter." I smirked, and she chuckled too, but shook her head. "I didn't mean something like that." She paused. "Anyway, have a good rest of your night." "You too," I remarked, but as she turned and walked away, I felt a steadily increasing urge to say something, to ask her why she was with this guy that looked like he could be her dad, to inquire more about this crazy overnight thing she was hinting at, or this road trip-esque adventure she was on that had her at this infamous gas station at 4 a.m. But I was just too immature at the time, and selfish, even feeling like I should probably investigate what was happening, probably pay more attention to what was going on. I also felt like I really couldn't be bothered. I told myself that it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't be nosy, but really, I just didn't want to get involved. Though a moment after she left the store, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I peered over the cigarettes at the truck in the parking lot. She was already inside, and at first it looked pretty unassuming. It was old and kind of a faded red, with 2x4s in the back under a blue tarp. All in all, nothing suspicious. But when he got to the turnoff onto 84th, and he took a right, I noticed the passenger side window was broken, like it'd been punched out. I couldn't see the girl well this far away, but her being in this older guy's truck with the right window shattered made me feel even stranger about the whole ordeal. Something was definitely off, but at the time, my lazy ass just didn't care enough. It was mid-July, though, when the veneer of eccentric late-night patrons was shattered forever, and I was forced to see what was really going on. It began with a loud rumbling from the parking lot. I got immediately uncomfortable as some biker douche rolled up, revving his engine like if it were loud enough I'd give him a discount. Then he climbed off the bike and came stumbling toward the door, the green neon flickering onto him from the window. I could tell just from the counter that he was totally hammered. He could barely even make it inside. He came right to the counter and absolutely reeked of alcohol. "Give me a pack of menthols, Camel," he slurred, leaning onto the counter with his right hand. "You okay, man?" I grabbed it. "The fuck do you mean?" His hostility freaked me out just as much as it annoyed me. "You're obviously drunk off your ass," I replied. "You just drove here on a motorcycle. Seems like a bad idea. Shut the fuck up and sell me the cigarettes, man." He was glaring at me like he was ready to swing, and though he was so fucked up, I don't doubt I could have taken him. He was still a big guy, and it really wasn't worth the trouble. "Your funeral," I muttered, grabbing the cigarettes and noting it was the last pack. Normally, I would have made some quip about that, but with this guy, I just wanted him to leave. When I slid him the cigarettes, he flung his cash at me and almost walked away without his change. Then he stumbled off back out the door, shoving it open so hard I wondered if he broke it. And then, without any warning, as he stumbled along the window toward his bike, his entire body changed. My breathing stifled as I noticed his head was dented in. Multiple of his teeth were missing, and blood ran down his face and soaked his jacket. He was covered from head to toe in cuts and scrapes, and his right arm was broken, the bone jutting out slightly. I stumbled back and tripped, knocking over the vape pens, then almost slipped on them as I scrambled to my feet and chased him out the door, staring in horrified bewilderment as he climbed onto a waterlogged motorcycle, the front of it totally wrecked. "Hey!" I screamed. "Man, are you all right?" He just looked at me, and as he stared into my eyes, his look was totally different than before. He wasn't angry or confrontational or even drunk. He just had this totally sober look of regret. He stared at me a moment longer, then he revved his engine, and somehow he and his obliterated bike sped off into the night, leaving me totally alone in the flickering neon. And then as soon as he disappeared up the road, the sign stopped blinking, steadily shining like usual. I sprinted over to the doors, yanking them open and almost collapsing as I barreled into the back room and landed in the seat at the computer. I pulled up the security camera footage and rewound it a couple minutes, desperate to see if somehow, some inconceivable way, I'd just been seeing things. But though I was willing to believe he wasn't actually injured, and it was somehow all in my head, I wasn't at all prepared for the sight of me just talking to the empty air. That's right. The guy never even came in at all. I rewatched my harsh reaction to the absent revving of his engine, my eyes following nothing walking along the window to the door that never opened. Then I realized that I'd never actually grabbed the pack of menthols. My hand stopped over it and handed nothing to no one. It was the same thing for the cash register. And then at last, I watched myself stumble back and fall, flinging shit everywhere in a panic. I ran out the door, screaming into the night, but only I was there. It filled me with a terror so paralyzing I almost just left right then and there. I sat there at the desk for a moment, shaking. Was I hallucinating? I'd heard you can get permanent schizophrenia-like psychosis from psilocybin, but this was the first and only time I'd ever hallucinated when not on the shit. And as I just stared at the monitor unblinkingly, shaking in place, I really couldn't tell what was more horrific, if I hadn't really seen that, or if I had. But then my eyes gravitated to the one part of my memory that was corroborated by the cameras. The neon. It was dim, and as I unpaused the video, I watched it continue to flicker, all the way until my eyes turned to the end of 84th that I could see. And as soon as they did, it shined like normal again. I rewound the footage again, And sure enough, as soon as I began to react to the phantom motorcycle, the sign started flickering. It flickered the whole time, throughout that whole interaction, until the biker was gone. So I wasn't crazy. Something suggested there was more going on than me just losing my shit. But then, what the hell had just happened? I didn't even go back to the front as I began racking my mind for all the other times the sign had flickered. And instantly, I recalled the scratch-off lady. I quickly Googled 84th Avenue deaths, thinking that maybe I could identify some of these people. But the first thing that came up was the police officer shooting. Then my jaw dropped as I stared into the memorialized eyes of Officer Brady. I could barely sit still as his eyes looked back at me from the computer screen. The same officer I had spoken to just a month ago, who didn't know about any officer shootings in the area, because he was the officer that would be shot. I kept looking, and before long, I found the scratch-off lady. She was some lonely, divorced woman that committed suicide in the woods a couple miles north of here in 2011. And the biker had crashed into the ditch right off the bend 3 years ago, one of many drunk drivers that didn't react to the turn in time and went face first into the canal. I screamed as the chime above the door sounded, and I heard someone spin around at the front of the store, startled by my reaction. I scrambled to my feet and walked up front, freezing as my eyes met those of Officer Brady's, glinting in the flickering neon. "You good?" He seemed to be both concerned and frustrated. I just stared at him, totally unable to speak. "Yeah. You on something?" He peered. "No." He looked at me a little longer, but then he walked his immortalized path through the gas station, his gaze drifting over the cooler of energy drinks. I couldn't help but stare right at him, utterly wordless as he moved in almost the exact same way as he had back in June, at last grabbing that same sugar-free monster. Then he walked to the counter, and my hands were shaking as I took the drink from him. "Hey," he looked at me. "You all right?" I stared into the eyes of the dead man. "Personal stuff. Is something going on?" "Looked like you were looking at the security camera footage when I came in," he noted, and I listened in silence. If someone's prowling around here, I could investigate. I wanted to address what was really happening, to pick his mind, and see if he was really unaware that he was dead, or if he was just haunting this place, and all of this was an act. Then I began to wonder if maybe this was some kind of time machine, if I could warn him about what was bound to happen to him and prevent him from dying in the first place. But as I recalled the biker's corpse mounting his waterlogged Harley, I came to the conclusion that nothing I said to this visage of the officer was going to save his life. And, I further waged, as soon as he walked out that door, he'd be a corpse too. "You there?" He waved his hand in front of my face. "Talk to me, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. "Yeah, I'm fine." I slid him his drink. "You gonna tell me the total?" "It's free tonight." "On me. Have a good one, Officer Brady." He blinked. He stood there for a moment as if considering investigating the gas station regardless of my cooperation, trying to get to the bottom of my unusual behavior. And maybe in life, he would have. But his fateful march to the street where his life would be taken from him seemed programmed to resume as he suddenly turned and walked out the door, just like he had the last time back in June, taking his energy drink with him. I followed him outside, standing beneath the fluctuating sign as my eyes fell onto the exit wounds in his back, the red streaks oozing from the holes in his uniform. I felt like I could cry at the sight of it. I walked back inside and had made my mind up to quit then and there. I wrote up a note and left it in the manager's office. Then I locked the place up and left the key under the propane cylinder exchange out front. About to text my morning relief where the key was when I froze. I remembered the girl with black hair and big brown eyes. The neon sign that I had once thought of as my early warning customer alert, and now understood to be some kind of paranormal detection radar, had flickered with her entrance too, just like it had for the biker and the scratch-off lady and Officer Brady. In that moment, I became weirdly consumed with this desire to know what had happened to her. Maybe it was because I found her cute, or maybe it was because even in the moment that night, something felt horribly off. But for some reason or another, I became totally invested in figuring out what had happened to her, to the point that I decided to unlock the store and stick around. I went back to the computer, but for some reason, though I was able to find information about other people that had died in the area, some of whom I'd even seen walk into this gas station's very doors in the middle of the night, I was completely unable to find her, and it really ate at me. I went back to the front at some point around 5 a.m., but still, I was just searching on my phone for the girl, though by the time my relief came in at 6 a.m., I still hadn't found shit. And that was my obsession for the next couple days. When I'd exhausted every article about deaths on 84th, I began to wonder if anyone even knew she was dead. So I searched local missing persons, and I looked into all of them, but still none of them were this girl. It haunted me for days. I began reliving as much of that night as I could, trying to recall every single detail. I could remember her hinting that the guy she was with was her boyfriend, which even then was a red flag. But now, as I remembered that older guy in the parking lot pumping gas in the dark, it filled me with dread. I didn't get that good of a look at him. I could tell he had some stubble and was wearing a flannel jeans and boots, but what good was that? As for his truck, I wasn't sure exactly what make or model it was, just that it was red and looked old. I could only assume the punched-out glass was like the biker's motorcycle, something that had taken place after the girl's death, or more likely during. Then I remembered her asking me if I had ever done something crazy and overnight, and as I mulled over the words for hours, sitting on the back porch smoking a bowl as the sun set before my shift, I ruminated on all the possibilities such a vague statement could mean. But then, when I remembered her saying she was on something like a road trip, it started to click. The guy she was with, her boyfriend, must have been taking her off somewhere, probably far from her home. Maybe they'd been talking online, probably in secret, 'cause no parent would let their kid date a grown-ass man like that, and she seemed to be about 18 like myself. Maybe he'd driven to where she lived, and this big, crazy, overnight decision she made was climbing into this stranger's vehicle that she'd been tricked into thinking was safe, driving with him for God knows how long as he took her to God knows where. And then they stopped at the pass and go on 84th Avenue for gas. At first, that part didn't make sense to me. Yeah, this place was a couple miles south of 90th Street, which came right off the highway. But why wouldn't he stop for gas at one of the many gas stations out there closer to the interstate? Though the more I thought about it, the more I started to piece it together. If this guy really was from out of state and was trying to get her back to his place undetected, it made sense he didn't pull right off the highway to the nearest gas station where cops could be combing through camera footage. Instead, he drove off to the most secluded road in the whole town, 84th Avenue. I started to feel overwhelmed. I had nothing to go off of to narrow my search, really, and for all I knew, I'd have to look at missing persons listings for people in every surrounding state, and maybe even farther than that. I mean, it was just impossible. But at last, saying a prayer to whoever was listening, I typed in the vaguest string of clues I had. Missing girl, brown eyes, black hair, red truck. And then I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. I searched at first in various counties in Iowa. Maybe she was just from a lower part of the state. But when that didn't yield anything, I searched the same sentence with counties in Missouri at the end, and then Kansas, and then Nebraska. And then, After over an hour of looking, my heart skipped a beat. I saw those big brown eyes looking back at me through my cell phone screen. I clicked on the news article, and there, in her missing persons listing, was unmistakably the girl's face, just like the one in the gas station. I immediately read the article, like it was some sort of divine revelation. Her name was Amber Wicker. She would have just turned 18. In fact, her birthday was only 2 months ago, but her disappearance was 4 months ago, which meant that on the night that she'd actually stepped into the gas station, and not the memory I had cohabitated, she was only 17, making the whole thing even more disturbing to me. She was last seen on her front door's Ring camera, climbing into a red truck, parked across the street, almost totally out of frame. But even in the glimpse of it available in the video, I could tell it was the same one when I saw the 2x4s and blue tarp. My stomach sank as I watched Amber hurry down the driveway, looking once over her shoulder to the safety of the house she was abandoning, then reaching the truck and climbing into the passenger seat before it took off up the road. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a beleaguered sigh. So Amber Wicker was her name, and as far as the police knew, she was missing. But I knew she was dead. After all, every customer that had walked in beneath the flickering sign had been a corpse, and as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I assumed her case wasn't any different. So as much as I wanted to stop working at that place, as much as it bothered me to see those ghosts walking the fated paths of their memories through the purgatory that was the pass and go off 84th Avenue, I had to stay. I had to wait until Amber came back, so I could gather enough evidence to give to police. After all, though some of the dead only came in once, like the biker, others had come in twice, like Officer Brady, and even others had come in on almost a weekly basis, like the scratch-off lady. Eventually, I hoped, she would come back. And so, the rest of July, I picked up more night shifts, desperately wanting to be there the night she hopefully returned. I also chatted with Justin, the guy who I'd shadowed and who worked nights when I was off, but his brain seemed constantly fried on something, and if he'd had any paranormal experiences, he hadn't noticed. I asked him about the sign flickering, and he said it did that on occasion, so I knew he'd seen at least some ghosts. But when I asked him about Amber, he wasn't sure if he'd seen her or not. Needless to say, I wasn't getting anything useful out of him. I asked him to just keep his eyes open for her, and if he saw her, to note the license plate of the truck by the pump. You'd think such a strange request would raise an eyebrow, but he was so zombified on whatever the hell it was he was abusing in his off time that he just said, sure. In the weeks after I'd pinned down Amber's true identity, I began to research her a bit. I could only find 2 articles about her. One was the one I first found, which just had the basic details of her disappearance, and the other was an even smaller article in which her parents had given a statement and a number to call if anyone knew anything. I really wanted to call that number, but I knew that right now, I honestly didn't have shit. I could always say I was at the gas station that night and saw something, but the security camera footage only went back 60 days, so there'd be no proof one way or the other. I didn't have a license plate, and I was a whole state over. I didn't have a lot of faith the police would be able to do much with that, and I didn't want to give her parents false hope. So I decided I'd just wait until her memory replayed again, and I could piece together some actionable details. In the meantime, the more I searched her, I was at last able to find some of her socials. But her Instagram was private, and her Twitter was inactive for years. Though when I stumbled upon her Facebook, even though it, too, hadn't had a post uploaded in 2 years, I felt strangely more connected to her as I scrolled through her photos, this immortal anthology of a dead girl's time on Earth, floating in cyberspace for anyone to find and sharing her memories from before her life was prematurely snuffed out. I found pictures of her laughing with her friends, smiling at a dance, blowing out birthday candles. I saw random posts ranging from her excitedly proclaiming she'd gotten her learner's permit to complaining about failing some biology test. All these moments of this girl's life, both significant and insignificant, were here forever, memories accessible to anyone that cared to find them. And really, her appearance at the gas station wasn't much different, though that memory was supernatural, unfolding in real time over a real place. It was, in essence, the same, just some moment of her existence that unaffiliated people such as myself were able to witness, though whether or not I had been the one to see it for a reason, or my witnessing of it was just as inconsequential and random as me scrolling through her Facebook page, I felt that I was a part of this girl's story now, and it was my duty to help her however I could. But by August, she still hadn't come back. And strangely, neither had Officer Brady or the biker, or even the scratch-off lady. There was only one other occurrence of the sign flickering, and I guess it was either a no-show ghost or a fuck you from the universe, 'cause no one ended up coming in. I got worried that whatever supernatural phenomenon had been taking place was over just as suddenly as it had begun, and that I'd never see her again, never be given a chance to atone for my apathetic complacency that night when I could have paid more attention to a situation that was obviously suspicious. And even worse, I was shipping off to college in just a couple of weeks. My remaining days at the pass and go were numbered. So on August 3rd, while sitting behind the counter in the dead of night, waiting for the purgatorial replay of an apparition's final stop on the drive to her untimely death, I made up my mind. If she didn't come in tonight, then tomorrow, I'd take matters into my own hands. It dawned on me that Amber must have died nearby here. The only ghosts that ever walked into this gas station were those that had died on 84th Avenue, and that was true for Officer Brady, who had been shot just down the road, the biker who had crashed into the canal by the bend, the scratch-off lady who had hanged herself in the woods, and all the others I'd seen walk through those doors beneath the flickering green glow. And though I had no idea where to look, I had one thing to go off of. I'd seen the truck turn right at the turnoff. So somewhere north of here she must have died. And maybe, just maybe, I could figure out where. By morning, I still hadn't seen her, or any ghost for that matter. And after chatting with Tegan, my morning relief, I walked out to my car. But though I'd planned on driving home and getting some sleep, then searching later, I just couldn't resist the urge to look right then and there. And so, in my pass-and-go uniform and all, I walked over to the turnoff, where I'd seen that phantom truck head right, and then did the same, walking north up the road. The sun was just barely rising over the trees, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd appreciated a sunrise. Usually, I sped home, trying to beat the sunlight to my room where I could shut my blackout curtains and crash as if it were still night. Then I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. But this morning, moving slowly up the road along the canal and constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary, I couldn't help but enjoy the orange glow above the trees. By the time I'd walked about 2 miles, the sun was fully above the horizon, and cars were starting to sparingly appear on 84th, though admittedly not many, as this wasn't the most direct route to anywhere in town except the pass and go. I'd already passed the infamous bend, and even felt obligated to pause there a moment before the canal, sort of waiting in reverent silence as I remembered the stare that Biker had given me, the regret permeating his eyes. By now, though, it could no longer be considered a canal. It was a drainage ditch at best, a muddy, shallow dip off the road, and beyond it was the forest. But then, in my steady scan of the ground in front of me, I noticed something twinkling. I crouched, looking down at small shards of glass on the pavement. Almost like a vision, my mind seemed to play out this simulation, and I was staring at the man as he and Amber argued. He lost his temper and slammed her head into the window, shattering it. I noticed more twinkling coming from the grass before the ditch, and I could almost hear the sound of his boots scraping the asphalt as he kicked the glass off down the hill, trying to cover up anything that had happened. Then I noticed something yellow peeking out of the mud. I stepped down into the ditch, grabbing the corner of the plastic and pulling it out of its muddy tomb. Sitting in my hand was a faded, dirty bag of Lay's Classic, mostly empty with just a few crumbs at the bottom. My heart raced as I recalled her placing the bag on the counter, and again, I could see it before my mind's eye. The man dragging her body out of the passenger seat, her dead-weight foot scraping the bag out with her. He probably didn't even notice in his panic as he dragged her toward the forest, the bag fluttering off down into the ditch below. I walked up the hill on the other side. I stepped into the forest. My breathing started to become heavy as I walked deeper into the trees, terrified as I anticipated just what nightmarish spectacle I might be about to find. But I wouldn't turn back now. And as the afterimage of Amber's conflicted eyes appeared in my mind again, I resolved to find where she was buried, so I could finally give her parents peace, maybe even give her peace. And it didn't take much more walking to find clues. I noticed 2 hardly visibly scrapes in the dirt, where her shoes must have been dragging. I carefully followed them, stepping off toward a cluster of trees as they suddenly turned, at last freezing, before what I could immediately ascertain was a shallow grave. The grass all around it was undisturbed, but here, in just this plot, was a clump of uneven earth. Some grass and leaves had been precariously scattered on top in the man's frantic attempt to conceal it, but it wasn't convincing. And as I crouched before the plot, my heart began to thump out of my chest. But I gulped and steeled myself, knowing I had to see this all the way through, for Amber. I wished I had a shovel, but with nothing else, I just dug with my hands, scraping the dirt away and trying not to consider the possibility of my fingers abruptly touching her corpse. I jerked as I felt something that wasn't soil, didn't feel like rotting flesh. So I brushed the sand away, and my eyes centered upon a filthy blue tarp immured in the ground. It was all I needed to see. I stayed right there, pulling out my phone and calling the police. And when they arrived within the hour, I told them I'd gone on a morning walk after getting off the graveyard shift, but noticed the broken glass and trash on the side of the road. They applauded me on my intuition, saying they probably wouldn't have found that suspicious at all. And hell, I certainly wouldn't have either, if I hadn't known the context. From there, I said I walked into the forest out of curiosity, but when I found what looked to be a trail left by dragging feet, I became convinced I'd actually found something serious. And after a little bit of digging where the ground looked abnormal, I'd seen the tarp and assumed the worst. They were kinder than cops had ever been with me as they thanked me, and in just a couple of days, it was confirmed in a news story that wrapped in that tarp and left to rot in the woods off 84th Avenue for the last half a year was none other than the body of Amber Wicker, the girl with black hair and big brown eyes, taking her next big step in life, the last big step she'd ever take. I was glad I had been able to help her family get some closure, and hell, even lead to the arrest of the bastard that killed her, whose DNA was recovered at the scene of the crime. But even still, at the end of the day, none of that would bring her back. I just felt hollow. Finding her body, providing her parents whatever relief they could find, and putting that monster in jail still wouldn't bring that innocent, naive girl back to life. And as I listened to a podcast on the graveyard shift on my last night of work at the Pass and Go, 4 days before I'd be heading off to college, I found myself constantly distracted thinking about that. But slowly, I got my mind off things, paying more attention to the podcast and starting to stare off into space at last, the shift beginning to fly by, until just after 4 in the morning. I gasped as the neon sign flickered. I darted over to the side of the counter and peered over the cigarettes. I'll never be able to describe the feeling in my chest at the sight of that old red truck. And though I felt ice in my veins at the afterimage of Amber's killer pumping gas in the dark, when I found her walking to the front of the store, all that remained in my heart was an overwhelming longing, an inconsolable despair. She walked into the store, the chime on the ceiling ringing as she headed right over to the snacks. I stared at her undamaged body, her clean black hair, her innocent, big brown eyes. I became emotional at the sight of it, trying desperately not to cry. She grabbed the bag of Lay's. Then she walked over to the sports drinks, and I leaned against the counter, my chin in my palm as I gazed at this specter retracing the final moments of her life, none the wiser to the horrible demise awaiting her 2 miles away. She grabbed a red Gatorade, then walked over to me, and I felt breathless as she approached, unsure of what I'd even say. "Whoa, you all right?" She looked at me, and I must have been hiding how I felt even worse than I realized. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, scanning the items like a robot. I cleared my throat. "What brings you out here this late?" "Nothing, really." The total came up on the screen. "Big brother?" I limply asked, nudging my head toward the heartless man in the dark. "Ew. Number, it's gross to have a brother." I must have asked the question differently this time, 'cause she stared deeper at me, asking again, "You sure you're okay, dude?" God, I wanted so badly to tell her to run, to just get the fuck out of here, to not ever go near that man again. I wanted to tell her that she was about to die, that he was her murderer, that these were the very final minutes of her life. But this was not a time machine. It was no different than that Facebook page from years ago, just a memory inexplicably suspended in time, just a brief expression of her existence that was as ephemeral an experience as her time on Earth. And nothing more. "Can I ask you something?" She raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Have you ever done something totally crazy? Just overnight?" She blinked wildly, visibly taken aback by the words. "Yeah, actually," she murmured. "Yeah, I have." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged. "No reason." "What about you?" "Yeah, I did once. I had this weird inkling to follow a trail into the woods, and I found a body, called the police and reported it." "Creepy," she remarked. I let out a long sigh, handing her the stuff. "Hey, this is on me tonight, all right?" "Oh, sure. How come?" "You just look like a friend of mine." I smiled hollowly. "A friend I haven't seen in a while. Anyway, it's my treat." "Well, all right. Thanks." She took her unceremonious last meal, then turned over to the door, walking toward the oscillating neon. "Have a good rest of your night, Carter." She glanced at my name tag, smiling slightly at me. It broke my heart. "You too, Amber." "Huh?" I said you too. She stood there a moment, as if debating whether or not she'd heard me right the first time. Then she turned around and walked outside, but I couldn't just sit there, and before I knew it, I was running around the counter, shoving the doors open and stepping outside. I bit my tongue at the gash on the back of her head, the blood dripping down her hair and onto the back of her top. I had guessed that had been the cause of her death, but evidently I was wrong. Because as she turned back toward me, I found her blue face and the purplish bruising of a seatbelt around her neck. Her clothes were covered in dirt and blood, and the Lay's bag was empty and faded. Mud clumped all over it. The bottle of Gatorade was halfway empty. I trembled as I found her teary gaze, the desperation and regret staining her painfully cognizant big brown eyes. not innocent anymore.
"Thank you," she whispered.
I couldn't possibly muster a response. And then Amber turned, the afterimage of her corpse climbing into the passenger side door of her murderer's truck. I remained frozen in place, my eyes following every last fleeting second of Amber's existence as the taillights glowed and the engine hummed. Then the truck pulled off, pausing at the turnoff, and then, as it pulled away, turning right on 84th Avenue and heading to her shallow grave, the neon of the sign stopped flickering, leaving me standing there alone again in silence.